CD 8.
Forgive me, John. I have been gnawing on a conundrum as well as my chop. The look he gave Pearce was very direct, as if he wanted to ensure that what he was about to say was seen as really important. I have need of a man who can command a ship. That I have told you. But what would you say if I also told you I have need of a man who has been a fighter as well as a sailor? Go on. I would add, before I do, that having alongside him men who would also be useful in such a situation would make that man very valuable to me. Pearce, being intrigued, made her speak, but Winston was not finished, and his insistent look induced silence. It would also be a task that, successfully concluded, could pay so handsomely that certain burdens of yours would be eased, if not removed. There is a question of trust involved, and what I was ruminating on just now was just that. Can I trust you, John? If I said yes, I might be lying, and I would add it is not a question to which any man would answer no. Just so, which makes it a question of my judgment, and so I am going to lay out the very barest bones to you. I have a need which requires a slight evasion of the law, one which may, though the chances are small, turn violent. Yet it is one that will return me such a profit, as well as a high level of satisfaction, as to allow for a rare degree of generosity in the matter of payment for services rendered. How generous? Winston threw back his head and laughed, but it was short in duration, and the look that followed the humour was serious. The nub for you, I suspect. I am also curious about how a man slightly evades the law. From my experience, you are either on one side or the other. Is that true, John? Can you not be placed outside the law merely by the malice of certain government ministers? Going back to your question regarding trust, I am not in a position to answer yea or nay. Which makes me aware I must say more. John Pearce pushed his plate to the centre of the table and leant close to Winston. Arthur, you must say everything. That induced another period of silence. Very well. I have a vessel in a certain harbour loaded with a valuable cargo. Those goods, bought and ready to be shipped over the Channel in peacetime, are now worth more, much more, because we are at war. They are, in short, the kind of commodities which have become scarce because of the conflict. No genius is required to deduce these goods must be French in origin. Correct. And it is also the case that, quite apart from duties, which in peace I would have been subjected to, now we are at war with the Revolution, such trade is banned, even for neutral vessels. An ordinance much flouted, I suspect. True, John. The Dutch make hay while the honest British trader suffers, as long as they are not caught and investigated, which is such a small risk with naval captains cautious and so few revenue cutters on hand to intercept their cargoes, while a well-placed bribe at the dockside will answer to prevent too deep a search. So, you see my problem. It is not only securing my cargo and getting it to England, it is also the act of landing it on home shores. Now it is pure contraband. Winston nodded. So you require a captain to sail it, some men to crew it, and of the type not to be too fastidious about where it is landed, given bringing it into port would be very hazardous. It wasn't shock on Winston's face, more a sense of wonder. I see, John. I do not have to explain to you as much as I thought I would be required to. You have a sharp brain, friend. One that would, I suspect, make you a great deal of money in the city. The only way to make money in this city is to have a great deal to begin with. That I would challenge, but this is not the time. For you have, with your shrewd appreciation, not to say quite remarkable deduction, leapt very far ahead of where I thought I would be. Yet you are still not far enough, Arthur, for me to commit to what it is you require. True. So I must tell you more. I must tell you that in this piece of business I had an associate, a Flemish trader, who was in a position to gather the goods for which I paid, and get them loaded aboard a vessel which I own, all for a very respectable remuneration. This he was in the process of doing when war was declared, which, though it made the trade illegal, raised the intrinsic value of my cargo to a point where a mere doubling was conservative. Can you from that work out what has gone wrong?"
Pearce thought for only a short moment. "Your agent has assessed that his fees, given we are at war with France, are insufficient, and he is demanding a higher payment to release to you your cargo."
"Damn me, sir, you are amazing. I cannot think of another soul who would have reached such an accurate conclusion from so little information."
"Why don't you pay him?"
That brought on a very clouded expression, and Arthur Winston's voice rose to a high and much louder pitch. "I'm damned if I will. This is a fellow who owes any prosperity he has enjoyed for a decade to my faith in him, as well as the trade I have put through his hands. Also, I have been fair. More than that, throughout our association. Downright generous, in fact. And what do I get in response? Naked greed. I have paid him for his services already. I will not give him another brass farthing."
Realizing by the silence around him that he had made himself an object of attention, Winston dropped his voice again so that only Pearce could hear.
"Besides, paying him more does not get my goods into England and sold, so it would be money down the drain. This fiasco has gone on too long, ever since war was declared, and I have been out of pocket because of it."
"So, the task you wish carried out is for your vessel to be wrenched from this fellow's grasp, an act to which he is bound to object to?"
"Yes."
"The value?"
"Of the cargo?" Pearce nodded. "In peace it was, in terms of market value, just in excess of £12,500 sterling, prior to what was owing in customs due."
"Now?"
"Take out the duties, then ask yourself what French brandy will fetch. Likewise Lyon silk or Calais lace."
John Pearce might have been out of England for a while, but no one could fail to notice how such commodities had risen in price. Threefold was a reasonable guess at the buying end. Always open to being smuggled, such an occupation, almost an industry on certain parts of the south and east coasts, had become more dangerous with so many Royal Navy ships now in the narrow seas seeking prizes. Where neutrals could sail in safety, Navy captains would balk at the financial risk of impounding an innocent vessel. An indigenous smuggler was at high risk, and that meant the cost of supply had increased, and, quite naturally, it had also raised to fever pitch the desire for those who could afford such outlay to have and display something so hard to come by.
"Let us say, John, it has risen so much in value, and the getting of it being not without risk, I am prepared to split a third of what I can sell it for with the man who helps me get it ashore in England. With a higher margin on my goods and my ship returned, I would be well content."
It was natural that a period of silence followed that statement. Arthur Winston was doing no less than offering Pearce a fortune, not a wage. That it was not without risk, and he suspected Winston of playing that part of the matter down, only served to make it more tempting. If he had enjoyed anything this last year, it had been the excitement that comes from action, the knowledge that in a situation of danger he had the ability to keep a cool head and a clear brain, as well as lead others in a dangerous enterprise. Failure was a possibility in any such venture, but success would lay to rest any worries he had about taking on Ralph Barclay. And then there was the other consideration. Emily Barclay, a woman he was now sure he was in love with. If he had put that subject to the back of his mind this morning, it was one that had pressed on him the night before, and would come back to haunt him again. There was no way he could seek to live with her, and that he was set on doing, while she was taking money from her estranged husband. That such a course would be rocky in the extreme would be eased by money. So many things were in life, and not just for him. For his friends, they could earn enough to buy their way out of trouble. Rufus paying off his apprentice bond, Charlie doling out a heavy fine to cover his misdemeanours, while retaining enough to set himself up. Michael, able to go back to Ireland and put to rights his family's debt-racked farm.
"If the risk is too great, I would understand, John," Winston said, his face anxious, for Pearce had been thinking for a long time. Hardly surprising, since this one stroke could solve so many dilemmas, and, beyond that, open up many prospects for the future in terms of what he could and could not do to make a living. "Where is the vessel berthed?" It was Winston's turn to take time to respond. "That I would keep to myself until I was sure a fellow was committed." "And what would it take to convince you that I could be?" "You know, I'm not sure." Seeing Pearce react, and not well, he was quick to continue. "I have thought on this so long I am almost made fearful by your willingness to so readily consider it. All the while that vessel sits in—" He paused. "Wherever it is, I am out of pocket to the tune of the cost of purchase, and a tied-up vessel earns nothing. While such a thing has not stopped me doing business, it has constrained me, and I will not deny to you that a solution would allow me to speculate more in what is a booming market." "Have you put this proposal to anyone else?" Pearce asked, aware that it was a question he should have posed much earlier. Winston emitted a hollow laugh. "I have never got further than a mention that what I want might be illegal, most people being the type to shy away at the word, and me of a mind to back away from eagerness for fear of being cheated." "Am I not to be feared for the very same reason?" "You are singular in many ways, John. First, by that naval coat you so despise, and the means by which you won it." "I have told you it was as much accident as design." Winston beamed. "Then there is your modesty." "There must be more." "There is. Perhaps because, having been a victim of the law, you respect it less. Yet you are a casualty of legal stupidity, not some repentant felon. And I go back to the words I spoke to you in the Pelican about the shortage of suitable men to command ships in any sort of trade. There is no surfeit of people available to undertake such a task as that I have outlined, quite apart from anyone disposed to do so, and even fewer in whom I repose any measure of confidence." "Do I need to explain to you why I might be the right man, in the right place at the right time?" "No. But I must have care even with that, eagerness being no substitute for clear thinking. But in your favour you are without employment if you do not wish to be a king's officer. You are badly in need of funds, and I think, John, you are not averse to risk." "Do you have the vessel's manifest?" Winston's eyes narrowed, but he was too sharp to fall for a request which, of necessity, would carry the ship's name. "I have a list of the cargo." "Can I see it?" "To ascertain the value, no doubt?" Pearce nodded. "I have it in my office." "Then, if you are finished your breakfast, my friend, I suggest we repair to that place this instant." "You move with too much boldness." "Time and tide, Arthur, though that begs one question. How quickly could I be got to where this ship is?" "If I told you that, I might as well just admit where she lays. And when you say I, you mean we." "You would be coming too." "Well, how else will you know which ship is the one I own, and how it is to be landed?" "By giving me her name, perhaps, as well as the rest of the plan." Winston looked him straight in the eye. "Which would repose in you a degree of trust bordering on foolishness." While Pearce was frustrated by the answer, he could see the reason for Winston's caution. Given every bit of information about his vessel, a man he had only met once before might be tempted to act alone and cheat him out of everything, yet he wished to show him he could arrive at certain deductions. "A Flemish trader. French goods. It cannot be as far off as the Baltic. More likely we are talking of the Flanders shore. It matters not. In time you will tell me that, just as you will show me the list, inform me of the minimum number of hands needed to sail her, and you must, in all conscience, tell me where the cargo can be safely landed, for I assume that in your deliberations that has already been decided upon." I am beginning to wonder if your mind is not too sharp.
There was no joy in that, so Pearce stood up.
I see you are eager.
It was odd that Arthur Winston seemed put out, as if he was being pushed to do something against his will, which had Pearce reasoning that a notion in contemplation is a very comfortable place to be, while one in the act of execution can be quite the opposite. Winston had thought on this for a long time, and very likely, quite often, had worked through various scenarios in his imagination, all of which would, naturally, end in success. Action brought on the possibility of failure, perhaps the permanent loss of both vessel and cargo, and that was less pleasant.
More so than you know, my friend. So shall we go back to your place of business and see first if what you propose is possible?
It took time for Winston to rise, but with a contemplative face he did so eventually. As they covered the short distance back to his chambers, Pearce talked as he walked, well aware that he was only telling Winston what he knew already, but his aim to convince him that his instincts were right.
I am in need of funds to a level near impossible to achieve, and that takes no account of time. There is no method I can think of, other than that which you have proposed, which will provide what I need either in the level or the speed. Would it offend you if I said I feel it is being rushed, and in such a way that makes me nervous? I apologize, Arthur. Put it down to my nature, for I am a fellow who, having seen an objective, cannot abide anything other than an attempt to immediately achieve it.
Those words made Pearce smile, for the only thing that came to mind as he said them was his single-minded pursuit of the opposite sex.
I am at your mercy in the article of time, but I am satisfied you know that I will not be dilatory once we have come to an agreement.
Back in Winston's chambers, it was confirmed by his neighbour that he had indeed had another visitor, also that the fellow was eager for a meeting and would call back at the same time on the morrow. Then they went into his room, the door being firmly closed. The list was produced, and what he could see only served to increase Pearce's desire to be quick about the act. Given the amount of cargo, he guessed she would be light in displacement, so it would need few hands to sail her if, as he suspected, it had to be a straight trip across the North Sea, and one he would not undertake if the weather looked to be inclement. More important, what Winston had said about the value was true. The game was definitely worth the candle. There were bound to be risks, but that was a state in which he had lived all his life. Even just being with his father, boy and man, had occasioned such a thing many times, and his naval service, while it may have been reluctant, had been full of hazards, all of which he had overcome. Still, it had to be weighed, and that he did, with a concomitant knowledge that there would be many unknowns. There always had to be, and it was how they were dealt with that counted. The first of those was obvious, so finally it came to the crunch, and he demanded to be told the port in which she lay at present, as well as the landfall he would be required to make on the English shore. It took half a minute of silent contemplation to get a reply. Winston was like a woman choosing a dress, or, even worse, a hat. But finally he did answer. My ship is tied up at Gravelin, having been brought down by canal from Saint-Omer. It will, of course, need a fair wind, but a northeasterly is fairly common in the North Sea, and she can be brought into St. Margaret's Bay, just north of Dover, where I have a cousin who farms nearby, hard by the village of Martin. He has assured me he can provide the bodies necessary to unload the cargo, which will, of course, occasion some payment. The notion was to agree some signal beacons on shore, certain lights at the masthead, and have him watch for my arrival, he having been previously informed by coded letter that matters are in train. And your vessel is of a type fit for the crossing? It is one she has made many times before to the port of London. What happens to the cargo then, Arthur? Again there was that seeming reluctance to answer, that hesitation, as though to divulge information was to weaken his hand. Since this would be in the nature of a partnership, I think knowing that would be necessary. A slow nod led to another delayed answer. It was like drawing teeth. I would sell it before it is landed,
at an affordable discount. A method I have recently learnt that has supported the smuggling trade for centuries, and one which removes the risk of interception by others. Now it was John Pearce's turn to hesitate. Everything he was being told, payments for landing and discounts from pre-sale, indicated a substantial drop in value. So the final tally would be speculative until the trades are complete, Winston murmured. But surely enough to satisfy us both, and I would suggest it is better to know what the profit would be prior to landing than take the risk of transporting the goods ourselves. Such a proposal made sense. It would mean hiring wagons and men to drive them, as well as carrying contraband through Kent, a county where the excise was likely to be active. Yet having settled on a potential figure in his mind, and a high one, it was slightly galling the way it was being trimmed. Still, there was no point in pursuing that. The rewards would still be substantial, and his task was to get it across the channel. What of the excise at the point of landing? Thin on the ground and not zealous, I am informed, Winston replied, before adding, If it is too risky for you, John, tell me about Gravelin. Right on the Flanders coast, a dozen miles south of Dunkirk. Winston then produced a map of the Low Countries to explain that the estuary town was one through which he had traded for years. Once a Spanish possession, then French, it was at the sea end of a canal that joined the River Aar from Saint-Omer, hence the ease with which goods could be shipped from the French interior, and the type of ship which, without being precise, he said was equally at home on a canal as at sea. The townsfolk speak Flemish, but Gravelin has been a fortified French garrison town since the time of Louis XIV, though the walls are not manned by Jacobins at present. They are still locked up in Dunkirk, to where they fled when the Duke of York moved to besiege the place, and failed to take it. But he is still in the field, leading the Allied forces, Dutch and Austrian, as well as his own regiments. Hence the reluctance of the French to sally forth and try to reoccupy places like Gravelin. You know this? I do, just as I know what was demanded of me as payment for the release of my property. You went there? As soon as I heard the Duke of York had invested Dunkirk, and that the French had abandoned the other possessions in the Low Countries. So, who is guarding it now? In the town, no one. But there are a pair of older forts guarding a narrow channel leading out to sea, which may now have some kind of occupying force to deter the French from raiding. But the type of vessel you will be taking out is much used in coastal trade, and so should arouse no suspicion. What Pearce was being told had to be filtered through what he already knew. The armies under the Duke of York were now reported to be near Brussels, and well away from the coast. So that meant Gravelin was in the possession of Britain or her Dutch allies. If it was so, then getting a ship out should be easy. So much so that he wondered at the need to use him, which would have become his next question if he had not stopped himself. Profit lay in that employment. Yet he got an answer anyway. It was as if Winston had read his mind. I can guess what you are thinking, John, but I doubt my fellow will give up easily. And in a zone of conflict, the means to force the matter legally do not exist. The Duke may beat the French. That got a terse response. He has shown damn little ability to do so up till now. And if he loses to them, what is an awkward task now will become 10 times harder. In fact, I could lose everything. Do you know if your fellow is fully manning the ship? He will have an anchor watch no more, I suspect. You do not know? The reply showed a trace of temper. Not for certain, but why spend money on a crew when the scoundrel has no intention of letting her set sail, unless I pay him a fortune? Tempted to ask how much that fortune was, Pearce decided against it. The man was upset enough. How do we get to Gravelin? There is a packet still sailing regularly from Ramsgate to Flushing. Pearce looked at the map and declined that as a route. Flushing was too far away from Gravelin, and on the wrong side of Dunkirk, which might make the journey risky, and besides, being on a public boat with the Pelicans carried its own hazards. Well, there must be another possibility. There is. I confess, I went into that before we had an army in Flanders, and I found, through my aforementioned cousin, there are boatmen in Deal with oared galleys that can get you there in hours on the right tide and sea state. These people would be smugglers, would they not? I don't think that question requires an answer. You know them, Arthur? In his reply, he seemed almost ashamed. I made their acquaintance, thanks to my cousin, with some difficulty, for no one admits readily to such abilities, or even the possession of such a boat. At one time, I had it in mind to engage them to bring back my cargo. But you decided against it. John, if you were to meet these people, you would understand. There are villains in this very city of London, but they pale by comparison to the men of the Kentish coast. Just to be in their presence is to fear for your very soul. If I engaged them, I doubt I would see a brass farthing, and I would not even be sure my life was safe.
Pearce remained silent when he could have spoken. He had met such people before in his life, some quite recently from nearby Sandwich, and his opinion had been that they were no more villainous than any other breed. Certainly, when it came to robbery, they need not fear comparison with the rapacious speculators of the City of London. "How do we go about engaging such fellows?" he asked, with a feeling that his rewards were about to sink some more. "And paying them?" It was a glum Arthur Winston who responded. "That, I hate to say, is a task and an expense which of necessity must fall to me, to be set, of course, against the future revenues for the whole enterprise." It was Pearce's turn to frown. Arthur Winston was a typical man of business, willing to speculate, but not to bear any costs he could pass on. He was about to raise the method of getting back should they fail, but that was not a prospect to which he really wanted to allude. Problems might present themselves, and, in the worst case, he and his friends would have to risk taking the packet from Flushing to Ramsgate, and at some point Winston would have to provide the funds for such an eventuality. "I will require charts and tide tables of the Flanders coast, as well as the waters of the Channel, especially inshore ones of the landing place." Imagining what could go wrong, the most obvious thing, apart from a failure to secure the ship, was to be intercepted while making the crossing. He had no notion of fancy manoeuvres. It would be set all sail and run regardless, putting the vessel aground in an emergency if a revenue cutter appeared. It goes without saying that these Deal boatmen cannot be told anything. Secrecy is essential. That made Winston cross. Then why say it? Only so I can be sure. Pearce was with Winston for another hour, discussing every facet of the task, gleaning by dint of subtle inquiry scraps of information about the ship and the required crew, gaining his confidence so that more was being revealed than it had originally seemed likely that the city man intended to give away. And he hovered between excitement, caution, and sometimes real fear, till in the end it was Pearce who was steeling him to the project with encouraging words and, finally, a statement of the position. "It is simple in essence, Arthur. Right now, you have neither your ship nor your profit, and seemingly little chance of taking possession of either. With additional expenditure, you might have both. So, do we proceed? A firm answer, for I cannot act if you are in doubt." Arthur Winston seemed to visibly shake before agreeing, but agree he did. "I will set out for Deal first thing tomorrow. For the rest of today, I must see about getting decent prices committed for what we will fetch ashore." The latter statement, being made with a more positive tone, led Pearce to suspect that was where Arthur Winston was happiest, making trades. Chapter 16. Emily Barclay was startled when she came down to the parlour to find John Pearce. It was also an awkward moment when Mrs. Fletcher, no doubt wondering at what seemed to her a stream of handsome gentlemen callers, lingered a fraction too long, and observed the look the couple exchanged. Not in any way a very clever woman. She had seen that sort of communion before, and she had no doubt that, careful of her own reputation as an upright widow, she might have to keep a sharp eye on this Mrs. Barclay. The two potential lovers made sure she was long gone before they joined hands and spoke in near whispers. I will be gone for a very short period of time, but I also want to reassure you that should the venture I am about to take come to a happy conclusion, then you may abandon the need for any support from your husband. You will, and I say this with joyful anticipation, become mine to take care of.
John,
Shh, Emily. I know you have doubts, just as I know what I am proposing flies in the face of everything you've been brought up to hold dear. It is in your eyes and your diffidence, but, and I say this with as much love as determination, you are dealing with me.
There was such a temptation, then, to tell him how she had purloined the papers he thought lost, taking them from Heinrich Lutschen's instrument chest, while he was, with the rest of the crew, fighting the blaze that would eventually destroy HMS Grampus. But would he be grateful? Or could such an admission possibly turn him against her? Odd. There was temptation in the latter, a way of ending their intimacy in such a way that she could not blame herself. "Is what you propose to do dangerous?" He grinned, trying to deflect her curiosity.
"Whatever makes you think that?"
"Your nature?"
"Too bold, perhaps. But I fear if I were not, you and I would be in limbo for a very long time."
"Such a notion is not without a trace of merit, John, for I seem to be rushing headlong into the unknown, which is not comfortable."
"You are the mistress of your own destiny."
Pearce mentally cursed himself for one word in that statement, and he saw that it registered with Emily to underline her fear. The notion of being any man's mistress, a kept woman, was one to induce terror, not keen anticipation, so he added quickly,
"And you are a match for me in boldness."
"No, John."
"Courage, then."
"Foolishness, perhaps." The opening door had them moving rapidly apart, as Mrs. Fletcher appeared with a tray.
"I thought you might like some tea, Mrs. Barclay. You and your gentleman."
The aplomb with which Emily replied was a marvel to the man who loved her, and yet another example of why he so admired her, for even he could see that the landlady was being overtly nosy. "Lieutenant Pearce, Mrs. Fletcher, who served with my husband, Captain Barclay. But I am sure you must know that, given the gentleman introduced himself."
"Mr. Pearce," he said.
"Forgive me, madam, for failing to use my rank. I see it as my duty to call upon the wife of a fellow officer."
"A fellow officer who is at sea," Emily added, in the minuscule pause, slightly shocked at her brazen lie. "But thank you for your consideration, Mrs. Fletcher. The tea will be most welcome." With a short curtsy, the tray was put down, and the landlady departed, Emily whispering, and not happily, once more as soon as the door was closed. "That is just a hint of what I might look forward to." It made the rest of their conversation awkward and stilted as they sat and took the tea, of necessity further apart. And it was also plain that Pearce could not linger, for to do so would only inflame what Mrs. Fletcher had hinted at by her interruption.
"I could say you will become accustomed to it, but that would be unkind. All I can avow is that you will be happier, even with such judgments, being with me."
"And where will that be, John Pearce?"
"Wherever you choose to go, Emily. Perhaps somewhere that we can live as man and wife without comment."
"Man and wife?" Emily replied with no great enthusiasm.
"Emily, I suspect you have yet to taste the joy of being a wife. I will make it my first duty to ensure that is remedied."
Well aware of what he was driving at, her face went bright red. That they parted with a stolen kiss did nothing to diminish her confusion. Emily, back in her own room, sat for quite a while in contemplation, aware that a decision could not be left to just hang. She must make up her mind which course she was going to follow, and then set about doing so, and this in a situation where advice from a third party was worth less than a pinch of salt. The word that kept recurring was happiness, the word she wanted to concentrate on being regret. What would she suffer in that regard when finally she set her course? That made her smile, it being so much like a nautical illusion. The choice was not between Ralph Barclay and John Pearce. It was between living alone or with a man she suspected she was in love with, though being of a practical bent she was far from sure what love was supposed to feel like.
Emily also knew she was incapable of dithering, and that a conclusion was required. Alone, she would be miserable, and always at the mercy of her husband. With Pearce, she would at least have a chance of some joy in her life, and it was that allowed her to contemplate undertaking two things. If, and this was another nautical allusion, she was going to nail her colours to the mast, then she would be best to do so wholeheartedly. She would call at the offices of Mr. Studdart and collect those court-martial papers, which she could then turn over to John Pearce. If he loved her, as he implied he did, then she would be forgiven for stealing them. If he could not accept her reasons for her actions, then she would find his affection to be less than he seemed to mean when he spoke with her, which would save much in the way of future difficulty. The second undertaking would be to write a letter to Toby Burns, telling him that he must come clean about the things he had done for the sake of his own soul, and provide, in writing, the means by which she could keep her husband at bay.
"I calculate we can manage," Pearce said, "though we might need you to swing those fists of yours to get clear."
"What are we about, John boy?"
"A possible end to scraping a living, Michael," Pearce replied, his face very serious, "which I have had to do most of my life." "You're not alone there, Pearce," Charlie said. "I've told you what the cargo is, and I've told you how much it's worth, and I've gleaned enough about the vessel to reckon she is of 2 masts and enough for us to handle without help. If the wind is fair and the sea is kind, we can do the distance from Flanders in a single night's sailing, and I'm happy to hover off the Flanders coast until conditions are right."
"What are the shares to be?"
asked Rufus, who then realised the way he had said that implied distrust of those present, when what he had meant was other parties.
"Ours, I mean."
"Enough to set you up. But as to how much that will be, well, we need to see it sold for a figure. But know this, I cannot do it without you 3, and I will not do it if you turn it down."
"What's to turn down?"
Rufus replied, looking around the Pelican.
"A life in the Liberties?"
"There's sense in that, Rufus."
That got Charlie a nod. The youngster was not accustomed to such approval.
"And that goes more for you, Michael, than even we two."
"It's God-given that such a thing should come along at such a time," the Irishman responded with a smile and a slow headshake, evidence of how low he had been since getting back to this place, for he was a man of positive mien by nature.
"Miracles and saints being what you heathens believe in, Michael. So say a prayer and let's sit on it."
O'Hagan grinned.
"Happen you'll say a prayer to the good Lord with me, Charlie."
"My pleas go down, brother, not up."
"Everyone answered,"
hooted Rufus.
"Are we on for this?"
Pearce demanded. It took time for Michael to nod, but he did so. The other two had never been in doubt. "How do we get to this deal?"
"By boat, Michael, through the good offices of a Thames waterman, a fellow I have engaged to take us downriver. He is sure he and his mate can get us clear." "'Tis a long haul," opined Charlie.
"We'll take turns rowing. Not like the last time we went that way, trussed like chickens." "Then I,"
Rufus cried when he realised the route,
"beg to piss out his boat as we pass Sheerness."
"Well, that'll frighten the North Fleet," called Charlie. "They'll be running out their guns when they see your weaponry." "Michael, you have those pistols still and the means to fire them, so we will take them along, but only to threaten. The men recruited to aid us in crossing will be paid in advance for their service, and must be told nothing. No word is to be said of what we are about, or where we are headed."
"Sure. Guess it's smuggling, John boy."
"Let them, for a guess is just that. But if they know anything for certain, they are sure to let it slip. Tight lips at all times, for if those Deal scallies get a whiff, we could find them waiting to rob us at St. Margaret's Bay, which, when I looked at a map, is not more than a long walk from where they reside."
It took Arthur Winston 2 days to coach to Deal, make the arrangements and get back, but he assured Pearce on their subsequent meeting that everything was in place, including the prices promised for the cargo.
"Once I'd put out feelers, I was inundated, John, and so was able to drive some very hard bargains, especially for the Leon silk, the price of which has gone through the roof, so desperate for it are the ladies of fashion. Once all costs are met, I think you can look forward to clearing £10,000 each, which I admit is better than anticipated.
Not by me, Pearce thought, who had started out hoping for substantially more, and he would be splitting that with his pelicans. Still, he would be well found, and it would be churlish to say he was disappointed.
I see you are once more wearing your naval coat.
A garment that makes it less likely I will be examined by the tipstaffs when I come and go from the Liberties.
And getting your fellows out of there?
There was an element of paying him back in Pearce's reply, for he was still holding to himself the name of the ship. Please do not be offended, Arthur, when I do not respond to that. You have no need to know. And while I trust you not to be loose of tongue, it is better for me that you cannot let slip anything at all.
Of course,
Winston said, with tightly pursed lips.
But I need to know when you will be there, for I have already laid out part of the fee, and I have no desire to languish in such a den of iniquity, waiting for you to appear.
Our plan is to be there at some time on the morrow. That produced a weary sigh.
Then I must take to a coach sooner than I wish, for I must tell you my posterior is sore from travel already.
Reaching into his desk, Winston pulled out several sheets of paper that required charts, as well as a hand-drawn map of the Gravelin quays and defences. Pearce recognised the layout of the Faubourg fortress, a star-shaped interior redoubt with the main walls protected by outworks and canals, very like that he had seen at Toulon. What was different was the narrow access to the sea, which was one he was determined to closely examine. Winston, talking, took his attention away from his perusal.
This is the name of the man I contacted in Deal, a fellow called Barnes. We will find him in the Three Kings Inn, where he does all his business, which is right on the beach, and it is he who will secure our crossing. If you get there before I do, make his acquaintance, for I would wish you to cast your mind over the arrangements to ensure they meet our needs. For I readily admit I am in ignorance of too many things to do with the sea.
What does he know? Winston produced a sly smile.
I borrowed from you in this, John. He thinks I am trying to get out of France a man with whom I did much trade, now in Saint-Omer, and under imminent threat of the guillotine. Hence the need for speed. I am going to fetch him, get him to Flushing, and thence to England and safety. Naturally, taking along enough men to protect us both.
A good story, which makes you sound noble.
Too much so, I feared. So I hinted, too, at a chest of valuable possessions, not honestly obtained. Let us hope my tale convinces him, for he is a devious cove, as they all are in that neck of the woods.
That left Pearce to wonder if Arthur had been wise. In his mind, an excuse elaborated upon was less likely to be believable, and the mention of valuables even less astute. Still, it was done now, so there was no point in saying anything. Tell me about Deal, for I do not know it. Except, Pearce thought, as a swimmer who failed to reach the shore, having jumped overboard from HMS Brilliant. He knew the beach to be high shingle and the water off the town to be freezing cold. Winston obliged, and made it sound like the worst place in creation, full of vice and villainy, leading Pearce to reckon, being a London businessman, he knew nothing of the common seaport. If Deal was a place of rough folk, drinking dens, whores, pickpockets, and violent robbery, so was every other anchorage John Pearce had ever visited, both in Britain and abroad. Jack tars lived for the day, and were easily parted from their money, so it was obvious that those well practised in the art of extraction would gravitate to the place where they were gathered, and Deal was such a spot. Sailors were also rowdy and given to making trouble, so it was also the case that the means of keeping their most boisterous behaviour in check had to be present.
"When do you leave?"
Winston asked finally, and that got him another look, and John Pearce an apology for asking. The last thing handed over was a purse of money for contingencies.
"I have made a note of the sum enclosed for the final tally."
Tempted once more to mention a failure and return through Flushing, Pearce knew by the weight of the purse that was covered. But he had to say something. To tell you the truth, I was going to ask you for some funds. I have spent everything Davidson advanced me.
Do this well, and that is a worry you will never have again.
Amen to that.
After a firm handshake, Pearce went on his way, aware that his extremities were tingling. There was a frisson of danger in the air, and he was in his element. The pelicans ate heartily before they departed, and they also bought some provisions to take as a precaution. Then they dressed in thick, hooded cloaks bought by Pearce that both hid their features and provided protection against the elements. Their boatmen were waiting by the riverbank, and as soon as they and their ditty bags were aboard, they took them swiftly out into the stream, which, with the tide falling, would carry them a long way downriver without much effort. There were eyes upon them from shore and from one floating bounty hunter who sought to hail them to stop. He was ignored and bypassed with ease, unaware that, had he managed to impede them, he would likely have ended up swimming in the Thames for his life. Before long they were swinging through the arches of London Bridge, brightly lit and busy, with Pearce recalling the last time he had boated through that hazard, for the tidal rush around the massive stone piers could be deadly to a novice oarsman. It was different now. He was seeking his fortune, not doubting his fate. Soon they were well past, easing through a mass of anchored shipping sat between Greenwich and the London docks, vessels either waiting to unload cargo or take it on. As the fall of the tide eased, they took turns on the extra oars the watermen had fetched along, keeping up a steady pace, leaving behind the smoke and buildings of London. There was rarely open country and clean air on either beam all the way till they raised the Medway towns, this being such a working river. As promised, Rufus prepared to aim his piss at the lights of Sheerness, but they had stayed silent as they passed the anchored ships of the North Sea Fleet, the great, hulking, black-painted leviathans of 70 to 110 guns, rocking gently and surrounded by their own filth. Off Faversham, with dawn breaking, they were spotted by a guard-boat intent on pressing seamen. But this was where Pearce's naval coat came into its own, for he was able to call out the name of one of the warships on the down station and hail the information that he was on his way to rejoin. Yet further on, the river estuary widened out and the tide turned, making the journey past the North Foreland a hard pull, and causing Pearce to wonder at how his watermen would fare on their return, though not for long, given it was none of his concern. Then they were round the great white cliffs and into the calm of the Stour estuary, with long mud-flats to larboard, hauling along a low shoreline through the first of what turned out to be hundreds of merchant ships, on past the first of the 3 rose-shaped Tudor castles, with the black muzzles of their numerous heavy cannon plugged to keep out the sea spray. These protected the most important anchorage on the east coast, the long bight of water where great convoys formed and made their landfall before proceeding upriver to London, protected from the run of the North Sea by the long bar of the Goodwin Sands. Those vessels, making a return, paid off their excess deep-water crew here. Many fewer were needed for the short journey up the Thames, those same sailors forming a well of employable men for those convoys heading out to the 4 corners of the globe. Thus, at any time, Deal was awash with sailors freshly in receipt of their wages after several months at sea, and there was, according to Winston's gloomy description, a whole raft of folk who saw it as their bounden duty to relieve them of such coin, and whether it was by fair means or foul lay in the lap of the gods. As a concomitant to that, given the propensity of tars to spend everything they possessed as quickly as possible, Deal was also home to men impoverished and desperate for a ship. The whole shoreline was lined with boats, hoys, clinker-built cutters, and fishing smacks, pulled up onto the shingle, and behind them the backs of a string of tall grey houses, all with smoking chimneys. They passed the stink, as well as the floating blood and offal of the local abattoir, where cattle and pigs were slaughtered, salted, and barrelled for convoys, which could be at sea for half a year. Boats plied to and fro, taking men to and from their ships, hoys likewise with supplies, while hovellers cast lines to seek out lost anchors and anything else fallen or discarded in the shallows. There was much legitimate trade in Deal, but Winston had opined the locals only truly prospered when the wind blew hard on a high tide from the northeast. That was the route from which danger came to this place, a screaming wind and high-pounding waves, causing ships to drag said anchors and, if they did not collide with another vessel equally in trouble, fight to stay off the deadly good winds, that long, wide sandbar that would suck below any ship run aground, but not until the local boatman, by legend ignoring the cries of the drowning, had stripped her bare of anything of value. Like the whole of England's shoreline facing France, smuggling was a way of life here, a constant battle between the excise and the men who resided there, with blood spilt and lives sometimes taken. There was a naval presence too, one ship of the line and a brace of anchored frigates, which made Charlie wonder at the number of sailors who must be present, until Pearce, who had recounted all the information he had received from Winston, moved to put his mind at rest. "They have nothing to fear in this place. I am told the press dare not enter Deal for fear of their own lives." "A rough town, then, as you tell us." "From what I am led to believe, Charlie. But it is no worse than what you know." Pointing ahead, he alerted the men rowing to a tall building with a flag aloft, bearing as a device a trio of crowns. "That will be the Three Kings. Set us down as close as you can." They landed on steep and crowded shingle, which had the watermen getting their bare feet wet. Not that they seemed bothered, too eager as they were to get from John Pearce the second part of their agreed payment, a sum which they could not have earned in a month from their normal endeavour ferrying folk around the Thames. Their ditty bags were passed over, and with a wave they departed. "So, my friends," Pearce said, as a gentle northeast wind plucked at his cloak, "let us see what kind of food this place can provide." Chapter 17.
"You're in luck, for the weather is good. Light northeasterlies and a calm sea, judged to stay that way for a day or two by those who read the sky."
These reassurances came from Barnes, a grossly overweight, fat-jowled fellow who was busy filling his massive belly via a mouth rarely free of food. Pearce had finished his repast well before, only to be staggered that a man eating when he came in was still doing so now. Tempted to ask if an easterly was not an impediment to a channel crossing, Pearce stopped himself. Speed was no doubt more important on the return journey than that going out.
"The fellows you need to get you across the water will come upon my call if they judge conditions to be right."
"We must await my principal, who is coming on the London coach."
"Nothing will happen lest he does so,"
Barnes insisted, omitting to say that money would have to change hands before anything occurred. "All being well, we will fetch him along to you as soon as matters are agreed." The dining room of the Three Kings was full, so this was a low-voiced conversation, made easier by the loud buzz of everyone else present. Naval officers from the Downs Squadron who, given his dress, looked at him with interest as soon as he removed his cloak. Redcoats either making their way to or taking leave from the army of the Duke of York, seeking battle in the Low Countries. Merchant ship captains and local traders, as well as men who were not engaged in any conversation at all, but seemed more intent on watching their fellow diners, making Pearce wonder what Charlie Taverner, who could spot a lawbreaker a mile off, would make of them. He, Michael and Rufus, having spotted a newly landed boat cooking fish over a charcoal brazier, had gone off to eat outdoors. "Tell me of the arrangements."
"You will have observed the salt marshlands north of Sendane Castle. That is where you will launch from before we lose the last of the light, this very evening, if, as I have already said, my fellows agree."
If the fat fellow's eyes could convey avarice, John Pearce had a pair equally good at displaying caution, and they reacted at the mention of the castle, which brought forth more reassurance.
"The Deal forts, Sandown included, have a military PK, but they are gunners, and few in number. They have no interest in boats being launched, and even less inclination to leave their warm fires unless subject to a general order to do so, and that is rare."
"What about the excise?"
"You are departing the English shore, sir, not landing. so they have no interest.
In between filling his face, Barnes instructed Pearce to make his way to the Ship Inn, which lay on the prosaically named Middle Street, and wait.
If all is well, I will send a man to fetch you at the appropriate hour, and Mr. Winston will be taken to the rendezvous should he arrive as promised to you.
That had Pearce thinking once more that Arthur Winston was not a natural intriguer. He had been careful not to use his own name. In fact, he had given this tub of lard no name at all. Winston should have done likewise.
And if your man does not come? Then you must find a bed for the night, sir, and wait for my messenger on the morrow, while praying that the weather holds. For a galley cannot go in any kind of sea or wind, and a decent tide at the right time of day is required to cross the Goodwins. It is common to wait a week or more for the conditions to be right, and not unknown to wait a month.
That gave cause for a bout of misplaced impatience. Pearce had no notion to be stuck in Deal for any length of time, but he was only too aware that, when it came to journeys over water, wind and tide were the factors in control.
How will we know him?
He, sir, will know you, for he has clapped eyes on you this very hour, as soon as you identified yourself to me. And, sir, I would advise you to put your cloak on, for that coat you are wearing is one to induce caution in a place like Deal.
Pearce reprised the arrangements to ensure there was no chance of an error before exiting the dining room, checked the arrival time of the London coach at the desk, which would not pull up till late in the day, then left, taking the advice to don his boat cloak. Once outside, he signalled to his waiting companions, now seated on bollards. They rose and silently followed along a quite broad strand, which fell away on both sides, a street dissected by the kind of narrow alleyways with which every seaport abounded, so constrained no two people could pass, made dark by the high walls of the buildings either side, with the wind whistling through to tug at their clothing. Middle Street, a lower thoroughfare than that fronting the beach, was crowded and full of hawkers, trundling carts and folk going about their business, including sailors in abundance, easy to identify from their dress and gait, a lot of them drunk, and the air of the place was generally one of merriment, hardly surprising given the numbers of places selling drink through open windows. It seemed every house was a dispensary of some beverage or other. As a thoroughfare, it conformed to what one could expect in a town that lived off the sea, with urchins either running around or gathered playing games. There were whores and hucksters, rough-looking fellows, local boatmen in tarpaulin hats and smocks, voices calling out, inviting the foolish to find the lady, bait a bear, or try the throwing of a fowl, the smell of food preparation mixed with unwashed humanity and the waste from man and beast, the whole overborne by the pervading odour of drying or cooking fish, for nothing could overcome the smell of a frying sprat. Charlie cuffed a near child who came close, with words that warned him not to try dipping, while Rufus opined on the street women, seemingly not put off by Michael's asserting that they were all likely to be poxed.
End of CD 8. CD 9.
The brick-faced building they entered was an alehouse, the room they entered small, busy, and with a blazing fire. Pearce, once he had the Pelican seated, told them to take it easy on the ale and went off to do a bit of investigating, which entailed making his way back to the beach and hiring another boat, this to take him to St. Margaret's Bay so that he could assess the suitability of the place for a landing, being in luck that the man rowing him was a talkative soul who seemed content that his passenger was just a fellow, with time to spare, out for an excursion. They passed in their travels, Pearce had them pointed out to him, the naval dockyard, Deal Castle, behind which there seemed to be a rate of building work in progress, then on through the crowded shipping to the third of the fortresses, Walmer. All were similar in design, bristling with 42-pound cannon that covered the whole field of fire to protect the anchorage and its approaches. They passed a run-down fishing village called Kingsdown, and, not long after, the beach ended and the cliff suddenly rose to form a bluff that cut off St. Margaret's Bay. It was also the point at which the anchorage ended for merchant vessels, the seascape beyond now dotted with fishing boats.
Good for crabs and lobsters tween inshore, Your Honour, but for fish, you want to be out a bit, though you might find yourself contesting for a catch with them damn Frenchies from Calais.
And that means rocks inshore, does it not? Pearce replied.
Only a hazard at either end, for, as you can see, I don't fear to row close to these here cliffs.
They now towered over the small wherry, grey mostly, rarely the white of myth, home to seabirds and stained at the base where the tide washed against them.
You can walk the shore at low tide, though you'd be fish bait if you got caught, 'cause them cliffs is sheer, as you can see.
It was not a long pull, something over a mile, Pearce reckoned. And then they opened the bay where he was tasked to land the cargo, a strand of beach with a few pulled-up boats, the whole enclosed by steep hills with a winding path leading up to the heights. To the man examining it, and he stayed afloat to do so, the place certainly had the twin advantages of a decent shelving beach and of seclusion. By land there was only one way in and out. But that could also be a trap, and he then and there resolved that whatever happened when he got here, if he got here, then he must have a means to get clear by sea, which he could not do if his keel was stuck. He would have liked to stay and see the effect of the falling tide, but ever mindful he was supposed to be a tourist, he indicated to his oarsman that he could take him back to Deal, which engendered a sly look.
Take you round to Dover, if you have a mind to, Your Honour. 'Tain't far, and the castle there is a sight.
Thank you, no. I have an engagement I must keep in Deal. The fellow was less chatty on the way back, given he had failed in his task of adding to his fee by an extension of his labours. Once back in the ship, there was no choice but to occupy the corner seat, which had a window by which the pelicans could sit and watch the world go by, each with their own thoughts about what lay ahead, though the past, as was common amongst friends, was more often the subject of their conversation than an unknown future, and Pearce, quite deliberately, barred any talk of future prosperity, that being to tempt Providence. They were fetched from the ship inn by a gruff-voiced messenger, to be told their principal was already on his way to the rendezvous, and, after a short walk, crossed a narrow brook that fed the stinking abattoir, leaving behind the habitable stone buildings, passing instead, at the north end of the town, through the tarred canvas shacks of the local poor, eyed by glowering men and their downtrodden women and children, until finally they reached the marshlands. They stayed well clear of the silent, low and brooding walls of Sandown Castle, its central dovecote catching the dying rays of a weak sun as the first of the lanterns were being lit inside, unsure if they were observed, but certainly pleased they were not challenged, heading along a shore that had as protection nothing more than the bank of shingle thrown up by the normal tides, one, judging by the presence of sand underfoot, that was easily overcome by any kind of storm. Once atop that bank, they could see in the fading light that the tide was high, the sea state benign, while the wind was gentle on their faces. Pearce did not like the look of the men who would launch and row the galley. Quite a crowd, given their numbers exceeded the number of oars, their grim expressions and bearded faces not softened by twilight. Short in the leg types, with broad shoulders, none of them old, men who eyed Michael O'Hagan as if he was some kind of freak, and mumbled insulting asides about long-legged paddies who stole the grub of honest Englishmen, remarks that would have got them a clout had Pearce not restrained his friend. Arthur Winston was there, well wrapped up, his hat clamped on his head, and a thick woolen comforter round his neck and lower face. When he spoke, even muffled, it was as if he was in terror of what he might face, and the brevity of the introduction Pearce made to his friends underlined that, for he shied away from any temptation to engage them in conversation after a general reference to their shared knowledge of the Pelican Tavern, quickly taking Pearce aside to whisper to him, "I must tell you, John, I am no great shakes on water. In fact, being at sea upsets me, and that, I must tell you, is on something more substantial than what we will sit on in this night." "Then let us hope those fellows get us across in short order. And mind this, they would not risk their lives, so they will be unlikely to be risking yours." The boat itself, set just out of the water on logs of round timber, was sound enough, light in weight by the look of its raked timbers, 3 times the length of a naval cutter, though no wider in the beam, with seating for 12 oarsmen aside and room in the middle for enough cargo to make a trip worthwhile. This now covered with temporary seating for their passengers.
"The big un and that sack he's carrying just forward of the middle of the boat," growled the leader,
he who had brought them here, the first time he had used more than one word.
"Or he'll have us down head or stern. The rest of you take a place twixt the oarsmen as you see fit."
"Where will you be?" asked Pearce. That got him a look that implied he had no right to ask.
"Sat astern, with an eye out for trouble."
"Then I will be close to you," Pearce replied, before moving to whisper to Michael, "You face aft, and I will face forward. Anything you don't like, let me know."
"Holy Mary, John boy, there is nothing going into this boat I like at all."
Pearce took out his watch and had a quick look.
"I think they will get us across safe and sound." "You sure?"
"I am," Pearce replied, before turning to a worried-looking Winston.
"Or I would not get aboard myself. Sit close to me, Arthur."
That he did, and when all the passengers were aboard, the galley was run down on its logs on a falling tide, with the rowers leaping in just as their feet hit the tide line, so that the momentum took the boat clear of the shore. The shipped oars, 24 in all, were in the water and quickly employed. The rhythm of rowing so quickly established it was obviously well practised, while those left ashore gathered the roller logs and took them to high safety. There was a mass of shipping to navigate through, and that too was impressive. For if Pearce, facing forward, looking at Arthur Winston's back, could not see the man in command, he could hear the one-word instructions that had oars on one side lifted, the opposite side left dead, so that the galley turned easily in its own length. Those same sticks rapidly deployed again, so they were never still. If that was notable, so was the speed they achieved when they hit clear water, evidenced by the creamy water running down the side, as well as the quickly diminishing bulk of the ships Pearce could see over his shoulder.
"Good winds,"
the man said, with his nearest passenger wondering whom he was telling, only to realise it was he when the fellow continued almost boastfully,
"No more than a few feet of water under our keel now. A place where no sailing ship dare follow."
There had been a bit of lift and drop from the run of the sea, but very little. That increased now as they went over the middle of the sandbar and hit a wave. There were, Pearce knew from his study of the charts, channels through the Goodwin Sands. Not many, but the main ones, and those which concerned him, lay to the north and south. The latter being the route he would take to close St. Margaret's Bay. These were waters constantly sounded, for the sands did shift, and the charts he had, the latest from the Admiralty, were very recent. Yet he could not but worry and consider it would be a damn nuisance if he misread them and went aground. Once they were in deep water, half the oars were raised, which occasioned a degree of curiosity, but he reckoned they would only employ all 24 again, either close to shore or if danger threatened. For even with a decent wind, he doubted there was a ship afloat that could run down a galley like this if it was going flat out. They were making good speed, with the fellow behind him, he assumed, counting off time by a method of his own, before he issued an order for the rowers to switch, those with their oars already working, not lifting them until the others were in the water and working, so there was no loss of momentum.
"How do you fare, Arthur?" "Not well, John, not well. But I think my stomach might hold."
It was dark now, with not much in the way of a moon, and enough wispy cloud in the sky to make the stars indistinct. Wondering how they held their course with such assurance, Pearce craned to look, and saw at the feet of the man acting as coxswain a half-shaded lantern, while in his hand, hanging from a thin leather strap, was a piece of fish-shaped metal which wavered very slightly. That being magnetic, it gave him true north, which was, as a method of navigation, primitive but effective. There was no way of knowing how long the journey took. Pearce would not have been able to see the face of his watch, but its time passed quickly, and, given there were 2 forts at the mouth of the River Our, they had enough light showing to guide them into the beach below the estuary, the galley grounding on soft sand. Their landing was carried out in silence, no greeting or well-wishing followed, and as soon as they were all ashore, the boat was pushed back out to sea, to disappear into the gloom of the night.
"Thank God that is over,"
came the heartfelt voice of Arthur Winston, as the clouds parted slightly to allow some starlight.
"What do we do now, John?"
"Wait for daylight, Arthur. There's no point in stumbling around in the dark. Let us go inshore and see if we can find some place to rest. And I would suggest, since we are unaware of what we face, that some sleep might be in order."
"Now that we are back on dry land and my fears are at rest, perhaps I can get to know our companions properly."
The introductions were appraised, and as they began to walk over the soft sand, it soon transpired that Charlie Taverner had managed to separate Arthur Winston a little, and he was softly beginning to tell his tale of past misfortunes and potential rewards.
"Can't help himself," whispered Rufus. "As soon as he smells a bulging purse, he's off." "Happen he'll become a victim if this comes off," Pearce replied. "Charlie, dunned." "Nigh that," Michael added. "I cannot wait to see."
Dropping back, for Pearce had no notion to let Charlie just continue, his proximity brought the tale to a halt. What light there was, then it was slight, showed a dark mass ahead of them, which turned out to be a long wall running inland from the sea, perhaps part of the defences. It made no odds, for it was not manned, and it gave them all, wrapped in cloaks, a place against which to lean and rest, with Pearce insisting that any temptation to keep talking should cease. Sleep was more important.
"Do we need to set a guard?" asked Winston. "We shall take turns, Arthur."
He had to peer hard to see the hands of his watch.
"But you may slumber in peace."
Chapter 18. It was a group of cold, stiff souls, thick cloaks notwithstanding, who woke with the first hint of daylight. Pearce, being the least so, having taken the last watch himself. Fearing he would nod off, he had taken to pacing up and down, as all the things for and against what they were about fought a battle in his mind. Yet at the base of it was a chance of freedom from the kind of life he had always led, which had only ever occasionally been secure, and then never for long. His father had shown an annoying indifference to money, pleased when he had some, able to act with equanimity when there were none, while his son had enjoyed the periods of comfort more than those of deprivation, especially the period immediately after the fall of the Bastille, when Adam Pearce's pamphlets had sold in their thousands. Likewise in Paris, following on from their flight, at a time where there were still men of means eager to pay to hear a famous radical speaker. A fear of dearth was not, he knew, an estate in which he was singular. Even men of substantial means worried that, by some stroke of misfortune, they might lose what they had and fall into the hellish pit of poverty. And he knew, for he had even got his father to acknowledge the fact, that such insecurity often coloured their attitude to those less fortunate, the very visible poor who stood as a constant reminder of what they might face if their means of existence evaporated. There is nothing like a dark night and no company to provide an excuse for introspection, and John Pearce was no different from the rest of humanity, having, as he did, on his mind, not only the task before him, but the possible benefits of a successful outcome, as well as the potential for failure. He might be unable to get aboard Winston's boat and sail it out to sea. He might misread his course, for if he was wiser in the ways of the sea than he had been when pressed, he knew the gaps in his knowledge were too large for comfort, and no great imagination was required to conjure up a vision of a foul storm, for which the seas in which he would be sailing were notorious, one that could send him and his friends to perdition. Time and again he conjured up an image of the voyage back to the English shore, sometimes an easy progress, at others storm-tossed, yet more with the vessel stuck on a Goodwin's sandbank. The worst vision was of him and his companions in chains on the deck of a revenue cutter, and when that recurred, which it did too often, he had to shake his head to clear it and replace such gloom with a more positive thought, often with the face of Emily Barclay, though that, initially a happy contemplation, soon led on to potential complications, for a liaison of the type he envisaged was not without problems. Thus, when the first light tinged the eastern sky, it was more than welcome, for with the rising sun came things to do, and an end to imaginings. Emily Barclay was a victim of troubled dreams, in which her husband had her in his power, and in this it was he as a slavering, ravenous beast of a man, worse than the kind who had so cruelly taken what he considered to be his marital due in the cabin of HMS Brilliant, the final act in a long strand of misbehaviour which had led to the conviction she could no longer live with him. The vision, which made her wake with a start, was of a grinning Ralph Barclay eating the papers she had left with Studdart, but she knew that was absurd. Having woken, sleep would not come back as her mind flitted between the faces of John Pearce, her hated husband, and a mob of indistinct people pointing at her for her moral laxity. Had she seen her husband then, she would have been more comforted, for Ralph Barclay did not sleep at all, pacing up and down his hotel room, wondering if Gearson's suggestion was one he should pursue, that he knew of some villains residing in the eastern rookeries of the City of London who might, for a fee, break into that attorney's office and steal what they both suspected lay there. What were the risks of success? What were the possibilities of failure? But, more pertinent, what could be the consequences of discovery? Naturally, he would never know the names of the felons, just as they would never be given his name. But in doing what was suggested, he was putting himself further into the hands of a man he was not sure he could forever trust. There might come a time when Gearson knew so much of his affairs that he would become a threat. Gnawing on that, Ralph Barclay treated it as a problem to be dealt with when the time came, his usual solution to such matters. He deliberately turned his mind to the needs of his forthcoming command, not least his shortage of hands. He had written to those he wished to take on as lieutenants, admonishing them not to turn up without a decent band of followers, and, if they could not provide enough of those, to get out in whatever locality they were presently based and press more. The pity was he would not have that bastard John Pearce on his muster roll. If Ralph Barclay took any pleasure from his ruminations, it was of the notion of having Pearce up at the grating, and that happy thought took him off to his slumbers as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. There was, naturally, a curfew in Gravelin, with the town gates closed and secured at dusk, to be reopened at dawn, so there was no choice but to wait until full daylight to enter. Pearce left his companions eating bread and cheese, for he had other matters to see to, an examination of the long straight canal that led from the walls and the water-gate to the sea. In darkness he had seen lantern-lit fishing boats heading out on the height of the tide. Now the first trading ship, with more following, was making its way slowly down the channel, not under sail, but poled, so that it could not deviate from a sudden gust of wind and run aground in what had to be the shallows, these indicated by the boats resting on mud by the canal bank, one or two of which had begun to cant over as the tide dropped. Also of interest was some of the detritus of the town, and the speed at which it floated by, which showed the flow of the current, indicating it was of a strength, combined with the tidal fall, to take a boat out to deep water without too much trouble. Pearce would need the same kind of conditions, and he watched with deep interest as the crew of the first vessel went to work with purpose, setting just enough canvas, their forecourse and outer jib, to get them out through the sandbanks on either beam under sail, an action repeated by those in its wake. Daylight showed the formidable reddish walls of Gravelin topped by the higher buildings, a number of church spires which testified to a deep devotion in a populace, while outside those walls stood angled bastions, water-bound outworks backed by deep earth. Properly garrisoned even now, it would need to be invested and cut off from land and sea to be starved out. The misfortune of Gravelin was to be part of that cockpit of land in constant dispute, the scene of endless battles between their overlords fighting the ancient enemy, royalist France.
The town had a sleepy appearance, as lazy trails of smoke rose in the morning sky, looking more of a place the world had forgotten than what it had once been, a point of strategic importance on the French border. The two shoreline forts were in a poor state of repair, parts of the land walls more gaps than defences, others needing to be supported by timber bulks, deep green where the waters lapped them at high tide. Beyond lay shiny mudflats capped on the shoreline with gently banked sand, while behind that the Flemish landscape was flat and barren in appearance. Most important was the lack of any discernible challenge from the forts as those trading ships eased by. Satisfied that exit seemed possible, he gathered up his party, making his way towards the first of the many bridges that crossed the canals and outworks which encompass the main walls. All the vessels, barges, and square riggers were tied up on the outer quays below those bridges. Nothing was berthed on the fortress side, and Pearce was tempted to ask if Winston's was one of them, but he decided against it. If he had not been told already, he would not be told now. There was no impediment to entry. The watch set by the town gate were more interested in personal comfort. The gatehouse had a roaring fire, than scrutinising those who came and went. Arthur Winston, on Pearce's instructions, had covered his lower face with his comforter. They dare not risk him being recognised, and they quickly found themselves in a wide street, with Winston leading them to a quiet tavern where he required them to stay until he had established how the land lay.
"Forgive me, John, but I must ensure we have not come on a fool's errand."
Pearce took that for what it was, misleading if not a barefaced untruth. Winston wanted to make sure his ship was where he expected it to be, and perhaps make a final judgment as to the wisdom of what he was about. He might even seek out the man attempting to cheat him and try to come to an arrangement, something that Pearce had kept at the back of his mind as a possibility. When it came to unknowns, that had always been one of them.
"Why in the name of all that's holy," Charlie opined as he sipped a wheat beer, "did I not meet your Mr. Winston when I was working the Strand? Right meat ain't in it."
"You would have taken him, would you?" Pearce asked.
"As easy as kiss my hand, mate. I had him going last night, and that was without the aid of a drop of wine. Cat and mouse it was."
"Cat and rat," said Rufus, which got him a friendly swipe, easily ducked.
"I am in need of a wander," Pearce declared, standing up. "I can't just sit here." "Suits me," Charlie replied. "Never be outdoors when you can be in."
"Michael, I'm with you, John boy. Sure, my ass is itchy too." Pearce looked at Rufus. "You stay here with Charlie. If Winston comes back, tell him I'm looking out for any threats to us getting clear."
"We won't believe that, will he?"
Charlie said. Pearce smiled. "No, he will think I followed him."
"Which would not have been a bad notion."
"Except he would have expected it," Pearce replied. He was aware of the number of questions in what Charlie was saying, as well as the way he was looking at him, and it was not just he who had them. They all did, and they were the same ones the trio had posed when he first outlined the proposition. He was also aware that when it came to definitive answers, he did not have any. It all came down to how he felt, and that was a combination of things made up of suppositions and needs. "We are here on Winston's purse, and he has provided the means to get us home again should matters not work out, while the chance exists to make a real killing. Not like your fantasy, Charlie." That got a frown. If he knew it was a fairy tale, he did not like it being referred to as such. "Besides, having got this far, surely we must see the thing played out."
"What do we really say if Mr. Winston comes back for you?"
asked Rufus. Pearce grinned. "Tell him Charlie has a scheme to make him rich, but also tell him I have gone nowhere near the keys." He and Michael departed, Pearce suspecting his other friends did not understand. If Winston was annoyed to find him not where he should be, there was nothing he could do about it. The man of business could not achieve what he came to do without the Pelicans. It was nothing to do with liking or respect now, for if Pearce had a degree of the former for Winston, he was not much given to respecting anyone.
If you left out those who had shared his misfortunes or proved, like Heinrich Lutschens, to be the kind of friends he could turn to when in need. The man he respected most was with him, drinking in everything he saw and storing it away in his mind. The town had been laid out to make capture difficult, even if the walls were breached, the only broad avenues running to north and south, the roads that crossed them east to west narrow enough to canalize any advance. Every group of buildings seemed to be laid out as a copy of the exterior bastions, designed to act as barriers to an invader's progress, and the high church spires were not just devotional, but prime places from which to observe and aid the defence. All of that explained by Pearce before they got to the heart of the town and the walls of the citadel, into which the defenders could retreat for a final stand. Acting as the centre of Gravelin, before the fortress lay a large open esplanade, where the town became bustling, with various markets purveying meat and vegetables, as well as all the trades that such a place needed to be self-sufficient. Groups of fellows, obviously in drink, were making merry around the edges, their raucous shouting getting them hard looks from the traders and their customers. Pearce ignored them. He was more interested in the walled citadel, for if there were any authority to pose danger to their enterprise, it would be here. There was also a long set of buildings, obviously barracks, which lay along one side of a quadrangle, within which troops could parade, as well as being a fire zone, which would expose an attacker as he tried to cross to overcome the citadel walls. Uniformed sentries, desultory in their manner, guarded the ramp to the citadel, and their clothing was white, indicating they were either Austrian or Dutch. Oddly, there was no flag showing anywhere to enlighten Pearce. Reassuringly, there was also no sense of coming and going which would attend upon a well-manned fortress. More importantly, from those exterior barracks where any garrison not under threat would be housed. Pearce even took a quick gander inside one of the doorways before continuing on his way, not forgetting to keep Michael abreast of what he was observing. Empty barrack blocks, so there can only be a small number of troops here, and if they lack numbers, they may well lack curiosity. Listen, John Boy, Michael said, cutting off the flow of information. Exiting the esplanade into one of the narrow streets that fed it, they'd just passed another tavern, one set back from the road with an open courtyard to the front, and both had heard the sound of singing. It was Michael, stopping him talking, that allowed Pearce to hear what the Irishman had already picked up. English? O'Hagan nodded. Stay here while I have a gander. Responding to a quizzical look with a slightly terse comment, Sure, one man looking will not cause a ripple, but two might. Pearce did not agree, because Michael was of a size to do that on his own, so he dogged his heels as the voices grew louder, enough now for the words to be identifiable as a rude drinking song. The place they entered was packed, full of smoke and noise, with a fair number of men obviously drunk. There were women bearing jugs, moving to and fro, but even more of their fellows engaged with females who were whores by their manner, some flirting, others occupying a knee, while there seemed to be a degree of traffic of both sexes to and from the upper floor. Full of the damned heathens, Michael said, more in envy than anger. And all very oiled. Makes me hearken for the Pelican. Pearce peered through the fog in vain for a place to sit. All the tables and chairs were occupied, while he was also aware they were being examined by quite a few of the drinkers, and not kindly, which had him whispering to Michael, Hard bargains by the look of them. Sure, I would say they ain't much different from them lot that fetched us over last night. They're certainly enjoying themselves, and spending freely. Pearce shrugged. Nothing to do with us, Michael, and I'm not minded to ask who they are. John Boy, think on this. If they're like those boatmen from last night, they would not be here in such numbers if they could not come and go as they please. Let us hope you have the right of it. Shall we try for a place to sit? No. Time to be making our way back. A troubled Arthur Winston was awaiting them, and it was clear his annoyance was directed at John Pearce, an attitude that fell on stony ground. I think you are too sanguine about things, my friend, but I am not.
We heard fellows carousing in English, Michael added. Lots of them. You heard it too? You did not say before this was a place much frequented by our countrymen. It is a trading port, and always has been. Even with a war on? Winston threw his hands up in a gesture of hopelessness. Such a thing is of no concern to me. I am here upon my own affairs. A fair point, Arthur. What about your ship? She's berthed where I last saw her, and still loaded. Rigged for sea? I would say so, yes, but I lack your knowledge. Do I now qualify for a name? Winston had the decency to look abashed. She is called Hemoine. You must understand, John, that once a man has been cheated... That became an unfinished sentence. After such a short acquaintance... This time he was interrupted, but gently so. It matters not. We are here now, and I need to see her, so I can decide what must be done to get her out to sea. Winston was up quickly. Then let us do that. As Charlie and Rufus rose too, he added, I do not think it is wise that we go as a group. It will draw attention to us. Suits me, Charlie responded, sitting down again, though I'm not much taken with this Flemish ale. Good, Pearce said, detecting a very slight slur in the voice. Then you won't have too much of it, given you will need a clear head. You stay here too, Michael, and keep an eye on him. As they exited, Pearce had Winston wrap his comforter around his lower face again. You dare not risk being seen, for it will not take too much to deduce why you are here. They did not exit through the gates, but instead went up onto the deep band of greensward, the grass-covered earth that backed up the fortress walls where the cold wind, light in its strength, seemed unusually biting. From this high elevation, Winston pointed out a two-masted vessel deep in the water, which testified to her being fully loaded, with the sails furled tight on their spars, a jolly boat hanging from her transom, berthed below the bridge they had crossed to enter the town, with Pearce asking what type she was. A bylander, and it is a common vessel in these waters. The broad beam pointed to the kind of shallow draught that she would need to sail canals, but it also indicated to him that this was not a vessel for any type of heavy sea, for with a limited depth of keel she would be much affected by the current, while at this high elevation he could feel the increase in the strength of wind that would play on her upper canvas. They watched for a while, but no one came on deck or approached the vessel, while, from their vantage point, they could see the ocean waters, strangely grey under such a clear blue sky. Is there anyone hereabouts whom we can get an opinion of the weather? John, it is so calm I doubt I would be troubled by it, and I am a poor sailor, as you already know. I need to know if it is likely to hold. Does your own experience not tell you? Pearce was disinclined to respond, mentally noting that Arthur Winston had become somewhat tetchy, behaviour he put down to the man's nerves. He was not a man of action. He was a fellow at home in an office or a coffee-house doing business. Instead, Pearce looked at the sky, bright blue with a few lines of high, wispy clouds streaming to the southeast, with the shape of a half-moon just visible, like a daub of faint chalk. There was no indication that the weather had altered, and, if it did not, he would have it, on the course he was set to take, coming in right over his stern, but at no great strength, which was far from perfect. Yet it was good weather, and that was not a lasting thing. To wait for it to be perfect could be weeks. In his mind, he plotted a variation on his course. He would head for the good winds, the wind coming in on his beam to up his rate of sailing, sure that the lanterns of berthed ships in the Downs, as well as the lights of Deal and its castles, would alert him to the danger of sailing too close to the sandbank if he arrived there in darkness. Those same lights would aid him in navigating the deep water at the tip of the southern end, where he could set up his signal lamps and head into the shallows of St. Margaret's Bay. Aware that Winston was looking at him, and in a slightly worried fashion, he finally responded. My knowledge tells me that weather is a fickle mistress, Arthur. But with the tide making and high in the hours of darkness, If nothing changes in that sky above us, we will attempt to take your Hemoine out at twilight. Now, I need to get close to her and see what numbers are aboard, and I would suggest that is something I should do alone, since even with that comforter over your face, you might be recognized. Once out of the gates, Pearce wandered along the quays like a fellow out for an innocent stroll, hands behind his back, stopping occasionally to examine a barge or a ship long before he came to the Hemoine, noting, judging by how they lay in the water, that some of those he looked at were partially loaded, while others were showing copper and obviously empty, and on those the decks were all ahoo with coops and untidy ropes. Most striking was the lack of anyone present. They seemed a trusting lot in Gravelin. Well short of Hemoine, her name was plain on the stern transom. He stopped to look, thinking she appeared to be in very good order, her black-painted sides shiny, and showing no signs of any of the kind of cracks caused by weather or sun. Moving closer, he could see the decks were clear, while the falls seemed to be of good rope and neatly arranged on their cleats, in a way that would have pleased an inspecting king's officer. The only problem being a growling dog, a large creature with her paws on the bulwarks, which barked as he got to the edge of the gangplank. As he was eyeing her, and no doubt alerted by the barking, an elderly, craggy-faced fellow with bent shoulders came up from below, his peg-legs stomping first on the companionway steps and then the decking as he crossed to the gangway. Staring straight at him, Pearce was given to thinking he would have struggled to look benign, which he did not, even if he had smiled, while the way he cuffed the animal to silence was harsh. He had a hooked, many times broken nose, far from straight, beetle, near-white, overgrown eyebrows, and untidy dewlaps of grey hair down his cheeks, all topped by a greasy woolen cap. The gruff question he asked, more of a demand, was delivered in execrable French, which, roughly translated, inquired what he thought he was gawping at. "Un bon bateau, n'est-ce pas?" About to ask if he was the owner, which might start a conversation and provide some information, his flattering description was met with a jerked thumb and 2 words spat out with real venom. "Privé" and "Marché." There was no point in doing other in response than giving a shrug and moving on, which Pearce did with the same air of insouciance as he had used in approach. Aware he was being watched by the old misery, he stopped to look down into the next berthed vessel, a lugger, its deck being well below the level of the quay. He was hoping his adopted air of curiosity would send the irascible bugger back below, but it was not to be. The old fellow kept him under view, forcing him to walk on. In truth, he had already gathered all the information he could reasonably hope to get, and was again stuck with a series of unknowns. Were those furled sails of good canvas? Was there water in the well, and how did it smell? Of rot, or just the usual odour of damp wood? What was the rigging like, though what he had seen looked to be sound and well maintained? More worrying was the fact that, if that old sod was keeping a sharp eye out, he could not get along this open quay without being seen. Against that, he saw no evidence that he would have to deal with anything other than that one watchkeeper. With a firmer step, he retraced his walk, passing the Hemoine again, which was done under observation from those same beetle-browed eyes, though the fellow made a dumb show of working on the binnacle brasswork. Pearce did not even look at him. He went by as though he had purpose, but the feeling of that basilisk look of deep suspicion boring into his back was palpable. Once back inside the walls, he made his way back up to the point at which Winston had first identified the ship. He lay down to avoid being spotted, then spent a whole hour watching the old fellow come and go from below, pleased there was no evidence of anyone else aboard, his back warmed by the sun, his front chilled by the damp grass. The whole quay remained relatively deserted, with only the odd person walking to and fro, which he put down to the low tide, making it impossible to contemplate setting sail. Back at the tavern, as he entered, he was met by a quartet of inquiring looks, most earnestly from Arthur Winston. That met with a nod and the information that his supposition looked to be correct. There was only an anchor watch, and not one that could not be dealt with. That was followed by a question.
What are the signals you have arranged at the landing place?"
The look that crossed Winston's face had, once more, that air of caution, which irritated Pearce. What in the name of creation was wrong with the man? His eyes dropped, as did his head, and Pearce suspected he was wondering if that, too, was information best kept to himself. So he added, for it was the case, "It matters not. But we must go to the market outside the citadel and buy some raw meat." Chapter 19. Given a clear sky and that gentle northeast wind, twilight was going to be a long drawn-out affair, and still that half of a moon was faintly visible in the clear blue sky, which suited the way Pearce wanted to approach matters. It would be best to avoid violence. That would attract attention from any people on the vessel's berth close by. Also, overlooked by the outer walls of the town, there was no way of knowing who might see what they were about. Possibly a concerned citizen could alert the estuary forts, which would induce unwelcome curiosity. Hemoween had to be taken over quietly and sailed out calmly. The pistols, that same pair which Michael had wrested from the crimps, were quietly loaded in the tavern, while those serving were out of view. The notion was advanced by Charlie Taverner that more shot might be an idea. There was only enough for a couple of reloads, but Pearce was of the opinion that unless they had in mind to put a ball in someone, that would be unnecessary. As stated before by the Irishman, the advantage lay in the threat, not the discharge. After a last look at his watch, Pearce announced it was time to go, and, bill settled, they made their way out into the now deeply shaded street, heading for the city gate and bright, if low, sunlight. As they made their way towards the gangplank, they could see smoke coming from the chimney. Hopefully the miserable old sod was busy at his dinner. Pearce, as a precaution against being recognised, walked behind Michael O'Hagan. Winston, once more obeying the instruction to hide his face behind his comforter, bringing up the rear, while Rufus skipped along well in front, tasked to play the fool. How the dog would react was a factor, the hope being that the way the old fellow had cuffed it hard argued against it being well cared for. Folk who behaved in that manner tended not to overfeed their animals. Certainly it had its paws up on the bulwark again, but before it issued a growl, Rufus tossed the first piece of raw horse-meat over the side, which, whizzing past its ear, took its eye before the smell — they had bought some high, well-hung produce — took its nostrils. The paws disappeared. "Move," Pearce hissed. Michael broke into a run, Pearce following, both producing pistols at the bottom of the gangplank before gingerly making their way onto the deck. Rufus kept the dog busy with more meat, but two weighty bodies could not board a floating platform without the deck dipping and alerting the man left to watch. Charlie went to work on the line, tied around the aft bollard, preparatory to casting it off. Rufus making for the bows to do likewise, while Arthur Winston stood transfixed on the quay. An indistinct voice called from below, to which Pearce did not respond, as he and Michael, hearing the first stomp of that peg leg, took up a position on either side of the hatchway. There was an angry growling sound, obviously complaint, as he climbed the steps, but that ceased as he saw two pistols aimed at his head, while the light, coming from the east over the vessel's stern, shone on John Pearce's recognisable face. "Vous!" A finger went to Pearce's lips. "Silence, mon vous. Oh?" The pistol was waved, and the message was clear. Michael reached down and grabbed at his clothing, hauling him up to deck level, which produced a whimper of terror. This, as Pearce said softly in French, that he had nothing to fear if he did exactly as he was told. Passing his pistol to Pearce, Michael dragged him, it had to be said without much protest, to the gangplank, indicating to Winston to come aboard, before Pearce instructed the old fellow to untie the dog, which was still chewing on the horse-meat, and take him onto the quay. "Cast off those lines!" Pearce called, now with two pistols aimed at the old fellow, not in the least surprised when his speaking in English got a shocked response. "Everybody aboard, and haul in the gangplank. Pole us out into the channel. Michael, the wheel." Charlie and Rufus grabbed the long poles, hooked at one end, which were sat on the bulwarks. These placed against the quay and their backs bent.
As the gap widened between ship and shore, they were transferred to either side to get it moving downstream. Pearce called to the old fellow, reverting to French, telling him to stay where he was and not to seek to raise the alarm, an admonition that only lasted until he thought himself out of range. At that point, he began to stomp back up the quay towards the town gate, dragging a very cowed dog behind him, while Pearce jammed the now uncocked pistol into his waistband. "Thank the Lord he cannot run," Winston said, pulling the comforter off his mouth. "We're not clear yet, Arthur. Put it back on. Would it anger you if I went to assess the state of my cargo? I need to see it has not perished." Pearce shook his head. There was nothing Winston could do on deck, and even if he had urged caution, he knew the river current and poling was taking them downstream with relative ease. At some point, he would have to get aloft and release some sail, and it would be damned hard work with so few hands to employ at the task. But once they had dropped the canvas and sheeted it home, it should be plain sailing, with little to do aloft until they were out in deep water. Then there would be ample time, safe from interference, to get set a proper suit of sails. They edged into the long, straight canal now, the bowsprits pointing right out to sea and dissecting the two forts, both of which had the tide now lapping against their walls. That incoming sea would slow them down, which was the critical point. Pearce could only guess how long Pegleg would take to alert his employer, and also what that man would do to react. If there was a beacon within Gravelin, that could be lit to alert the forts. It was something of which he was unaware and could do nothing about. Yet another unknown. Winston came back on deck, and it was clear by his smile he was satisfied. "I cannot fault him for his care, John. He has kept the 'tween decks dry and properly aired. No doubt the cook's fire has helped. That we will have to extinguish for now. The copper has a sack of peas coming to the boil." "Michael," Pearce called, "get below and douse that fire. But have a look to see what we have in the way of stores of food." "Will we need any?" Winston inquired. "That fellow who has come to the edge of that jetty," Pearce said, ignoring the question and pointing forward to a small wooden landing stage poking out from the southern fort. Winston turned to observe a white-uniformed fellow, a soldier, and, by the braid on his hat, an officer standing overlooking the canal with a red flag in his hand. "Do you think he is there for a purpose?" The flag, which had been idle in his hands, was now lowered. To Pearce, it was like a signal to heave to, an indication to say he required to check their papers. Winston was on his way to the foredeck as he replied. Obeying a shouted suggestion, he pulled his muffler up again, while Pearce, as precaution, steered to get as close to the end of the jetty as was safe, calling for the poling to ease off so that they could pass by at a snail's pace. He eased the pistol out of his waistband and held it hidden by his thigh. "Be ready to get them going again, and hard." Winston was leaning over the bulwark, and what followed was a silent exchange, a wave as the flag dipped even more, and Winston calling something out that carried away on the breeze. This before he stretched out a hand to shake that of the man on the landing stage. As soon as contact was broken, the red flag was dropped behind the parapet, to be immediately replaced by a blue equivalent, which was aimed and waved downstream, an indication to proceed which had Charlie and Rufus poling again. At the same time, Michael came back on deck to report that there were a pair of food barrels, probably pork and beef, as well as a sack of peas, also the usual things carried by a sailing ship, but not much, given the holds were packed full of cargo. The conclusion of that exchange coinciding with the ship's wheel coming abreast of the flag-waver, who lifted off his braid-edged hat in salute, Pearce replying with a touch of his forehead. In short order, they were beyond the forts and into the tidal flow, so the poles were abandoned, and the 3 pelicans, now barefoot, were sent aloft to let go of the foremast mainsail. It took time, and the canvas flapped loose until they could get back on deck and loop the sheet lines onto the cleats. "What was all that about?" Pearce shouted to Winston as the bows lifted on the incoming waves, forcing the man to grab a handhold and grimacing to put his other mitt to his stomach. "He was demanding evidence we had paid our port dues, John. You will not have seen it, but in that handshake I slipped him a few guineas."
At least the propensity to take a bribe has not changed since the French abandoned the place."
That was praiseworthy, but there was no time to say it, as his friends, having been ordered to lash off the single sail, were now busy on the bowsprit, freeing the rolled-up canvas preparatory to hauling that aloft also, and more would be necessary, since against an incoming tide the ship was making little headway. Pearce called to Winston again, made sure his belly was stable, that acknowledged with a wan smile, and got him aft to hold the wheel, admonishing him to hold the head steady, this while he kicked off his own shoes and went to the aid of his fellow pelicans. What followed was a period of hard toil on the yards, shrouds, and the deck, it being doubtful that without the strength of Michael O'Hagan they would have got aloft all Pearce knew they needed, the whole interspersed with endless instructions to Winston so that he could make slight adjustments to their heading. There was shallow water to either side of their keel, and if the vessel was taken aback and the head let fall, they could end up running aground on unknown sandbanks. In time, their combined efforts saw enough canvas aloft. There was now enough way on the Hemoine to show a wake, so Pearce retook the wheel, and, now that he thought them out in deep water, he began to adjust the rudder and the sails to find the best point of sailing commensurate with the course he needed to follow. This as the last of the sunlight faded in the east, leaving a long orange-to-blue line along the horizon. Above, stars were beginning to show, as well as the crescent of a moon, which left the man on the wheel feeling very satisfied indeed. Things had gone well.
"Astern, John boy!"
called Michael, and in a tone that had Pearce spinning round. Emerging from the mouth of the canal was a crowded, low-sided lugger, its great blood-red lateen sail aloft, taut and lit by flaming torches in the hands of the men on deck. Grabbing the telescope in the rack by the binnacle, from the light they threw out, Pearce could see the pointing arms all aimed in his direction.
"Pursuit?"
demanded Winston, his voice strained on a face now devoid of blood. He was feeling badly the motion of the ship.
"It would be foolish to suspect otherwise, Arthur. Can we outrun them?"
"As yet I do not know." His original intention had been to leave the sail plan as it was. They had way, and time had not been of the essence. But if that was a band of Flemish traders come to the aid of their confrere, that was no longer the case. It would be best to seek an increase in speed. He had two choices, but in such light airs and given his course and the direction of the wind, he had to favour the spanker over dropping the course on the mainmast. For that larger sail would only take away wind from the forward canvas. With sharp commands, he had his friends on the lines to loosen the boom, so that it could be shifted to larboard. Raising such an amount of canvas was a doubly hard task with so few hands to work it, but eventually they got it up, lashed off and drawing, the increase in speed evidenced by the heel of the deck and the increase in white water running down the side.
"I think they've gained on us, John,"
Winston said, his voice again unsteady, having kept an eye on what was, they were now in no doubt, a chase.
"Let us see what effect our spanker has. Will we not need more? If we do, it will have to wait till daylight. I cannot send my friends aloft in the dark, they are too few."
Both looked astern, to what was now no more than a red distant glow of numerous lanterns. Someone had seen the folly of flaring torches so close to wood, tarred rope and dry canvas, and had them extinguished.
"If these fellows catch us, I doubt they will be gentle." "If they catch us," Pearce snapped, "they will find out what the opposite of gentle means. Now, search the ship and see what weapons you can find."
Pearce sighed then as a staggering Winston went below.
"What I would not give for a long 9, a barrel of powder, and a garland of iron shot."
That would have seen them off in no time, while in his heart Pearce knew his chances of outrunning a fore and aft rigged vessel, given the minimal strength of the wind, were limited in a lumbering and fully loaded square rigger. The Bylander had not been designed for speed. Indeed, with its shallow draught, it was not a creature for deep water either, and if the swell was slight, it, as well as the current, was playing on the lack of depth in the keel, this obvious by the way it kept seeking to fall off the course he needed to hold to. Against that, it was unlikely the lugger had any cannon either, so he was safe from that hazard, which would mean his masts and canvas would remain intact. As long as that prevailed, he could damn them to a continued pursuit of such length they might just desist, for if they were gaining, it was not swift. To board him from that much lower deck and get on to the Hemoines while she was under way would be damned difficult, so the only thing he had to fear was to become becalmed, an almost unheard-of event in these waters. At first light, he would get more canvas set, topsails, and maybe even an upper topsail on the foremast, though he did recall being told more than once that more sail did not always translate into more speed. For all he had got them out to sea, he was aware again of a lack of that deep knowledge which came from a lifetime of naval service. That would hamper him in making decisions, especially given he had no time for experimentation. Winston came back up from below. "There are a dozen cutlasses down in a rack, but nothing else I could see."
"No muskets?"
"No." Pearce, looking astern and calculating the distances, pointlessly cursed himself for not taking time to buy more powder and shot for his pistols. Useless as such self-castigation was, but well-employed cutlasses, added to their greater deck height, could do great service. He ran through in his mind what would come should they get alongside, for they would have to. He would not heave to. First, they would try to take his wind. That, then pressing their scantlings onto his, followed by those brave enough jumping up to grab onto his bulwark, at which point they would be at the mercy of him and his friends. They were not likely to be fighters in the true sense, though he would not guess at the depth of their anger or commitment to the purpose. Unless they had the means to keep them away from their own side, the Pelicans would wreak havoc on those scrabbling fingers. Did they have those means? Only time would tell, as it would demonstrate the level of their determination. More unknowns. They could, of course, lower that jolly boat and abandon both ship and cargo, but Pearce saw that as a very last resort, given it would mean abandoning any chance of profit.
End of CD 9. CD 10.
"Arthur, you best lay down and get some sleep. For whatever happens, we have a busy daytime at sunrise."
That was an injunction he also gave to the others, as well as reassuring words that, from what he could observe, they should be safe overnight, and they went below, leaving him alone on the deck with only the light for the binnacle for company, illuminating enough for him to see his watch and so call out upon the others in turn to hold the wheel for a spell. It was truly dark now, the half-moon reflecting off the black waters, the ship moving before the wind, so the whistle through the rigging was slight. Looking up at the star-filled sky, providing more glow than the moon, he calculated the odds once more. If they pursued him all the way to the English shore, it would be tricky. Yet that depended on what they had in the way of weaponry, and it was doubtful if a boatload of suddenly gathered Flemish traders would run to much in that line. If they did, he would have no choice but to run the ship ashore and hope that, with aid being signalled for, there would be enough bodies to discourage a landing. Eventually he grew tired of speculation. That his mind wandered was hardly surprising. Where it wandered to, even less so. It was Michael O'Hagan on the wheel when the first grey light tinged the eastern horizon. The unpleasant sight of that big red sail not a shock in itself, only in its proximity. They were no more than 2 cable lengths astern. As the sun rose on what was likely to be another clear day, the lugger came into focus, as did the people on her deck, and Michael, craning to look, was taken by what he saw. To get the telescope open and focused while keeping the wheel steady was difficult, but the excess time meant there was much more daylight available to show him the lugger's low main deck, and even then it took him time to realize what he was looking at. He yelled out for John Pearce to wake up, and as soon as he appeared, bleary-eyed and curious, with Charlie and Rufus on his heels, he handed him the magnifier.
"Have a look at the men on that deck."
As soon as he did so, Michael said,
Do you recall the tavern we entered? Yes. Well, I have to tell you, John boy, if you've not already smoked it, those buggers back there look uncommonly like the folks we saw drinking and singing. And you know as well as I do there's not Flemish, but English.
Arthur Winston's strained voice came from behind the quartet.
I think I'd better explain.
Chapter 20.
I found out that my agent had sold my cargo to another Englishman, but I had no idea to whom. Well, I have to tell you, Arthur, it looks like it was a gang of right hard bargains.
The question he posed then was obvious, even if Pearce thought he already knew the answer.
Did you know he had sold it before you engaged me?
Winston's nod was slow and full of meek regret, hardly surprising given the look he was getting was one that could kill, while he still appeared a bit green around the gills.
I must confess that I did.
How?
He sent the letter with a British officer going on leave, though he, of course, had no idea what it contained.
The next words were delivered in a garbled fashion, such was the speed of his speech.
I thought it might be a set of projectors trying to make their way on my misfortune, businessmen like me, who would do what we are now trying to do.
We're about to do, Charlie growled.
What do you mean?
Well, it'd be simple. We take the jolly boat and give them behind us this barkie and the cargo.
We could not get away from them in a jolly boat, Pearce said. They would overhaul us in no time.
A nice notion, Charlie, Michael added, if they be of a saintly nature.
But having seen them closer than you, I take leave to doubt it. You recall those fellows who got us over in that galley? Well, those on our tail are of the same stripe.
I smelt smugglers on that deal beach, Charlie spat.
And so did I, Michael replied.
If they are that, Pearce added grimly, they will be bloody-minded, and might not just take repossession of the boat.
Repossession?
The word brought colour to Winston's cheeks, as well as force to his voice.
This boat is mine!
I was about to say, Arthur, that they could then just toss us into the sea, which is the common act of pirates.
You're mad.
No, it is they who are mad, and by their lights they have every right to be. Let us say it's a possibility, and not one I wish to test.
We've got to get going, then,
Rufus insisted, to both agreement and surprise.
And outrun them.
Well said, young fellow, Winston cried.
Pearce's reply was grim as he looked around the cold grey sea for any sight of another sail.
We might not be able to, and there seems no one within sight of us to prevent them doing as they please. So, John boy, if we cannot do that, sure we has to fight them off. For if I have no notion of where we are, I know that we are not close to shore, and they are not far off our stern.
His friends looked at him for enlightenment, but they looked in vain. There had been no casting of a log, no notation of the course, and no writing both those pieces of very necessary information on the slate by the binnacle. If Pearce knew they were roughly somewhere in the North Sea, he had no idea precisely where, and none of the skill required to make any more than an educated guess. Yet not being about to admit his own failure to do what he should, he pulled out his watch and flicked it open.
Then we need to find a log and cast it, so we can get some idea of our speed. Damn slow, Charlie replied. And even I know that. We cleared the Flanders shore about 8 o'clock on my hunter, so we've been at sea for just under 9 hours. If our rate of sailing has varied, it will not be by much.
Will that tell us what we need to know?
Rufus asked. Not exactly, but close is better than ignorance, and it will allow us to decide how to act. There has to be a log and line somewhere, so go and find it.
He looked hard at Winston.
Can I have a word? Happen we might want to hear what he has to say.
Charlie, Pearce replied wearily, indicating to Michael to take back the wheel.
You will hear every word, for I will tell you verbatim.
Come on, Charlie, Rufus insisted. Let's go to it.
Charlie was slow to move, but he did so eventually, the words he posed to Rufus just loud enough to be heard.
What does verbatim mean?
Search me, mate.
How do we stop them, John boy? Depends on what arms they have, Michael. I thought they were just a bunch of irate Flemish traders, but if they're not that...
Oh, how could I be so foolish?
Winston wailed. We might all suffer for my stupidity. No, we will not, Pearce snapped. We are going to get to where we are supposed to be, and the only question that matters is, are we going to be alone when we do so? I don't see how...
Pearce cut right across Winston then.
You don't have to see, Arthur. I do. I'm sorry. You have a great deal to be sorry about. Now, that explanation, if you please.
Winston, who had shrunk visibly when barked at, no doubt also through his fearful imaginings and disturbed constitution, seemed to gather himself then.
I do not want you to think that I approached you in anything other than a spirit of honesty, John. That day, when I first met you in the Pelican, was the happenstance it appeared to be. That matters not. Get to the point where it ceased to be honest. The letter I spoke of came that same day. I got it upon my return to my bureau, and damned unpleasant reading it made.
Seeing the impatient look on John Pearce's face, he continued hurriedly.
I tried to engage some seamen to undertake the recovery. I told you that, but they all declined. Not from the notion of regaining the ship, you understand, but more from the illegality of getting my property ashore and sold. I was driven to making increasingly generous offers, none of which were accepted. Then you came to see me.
Someone you took the trouble to inquire about.
Only because your name rang a bell and I asked. In truth, given you had taken the prizes you mentioned, I was surprised to see you at all.
Go on.
Well, when we were having breakfast and I discerned that you had come seeking employment, it occurred to me that you were a person who had possibly less fear of the law than most, an adventurous sort of fellow, and then you informed me that you needed money, and perhaps a great deal of it.
So you thought, how convenient.
Please, do not make me sound like a deceiver.
One moment, Arthur. If you're not that, you are damned untrusting.
The required destination, I had to drag it out of you. You held secret the name of the ship until we were across the channel, and, as of this moment, I have no idea of the signal those ashore are waiting for because you have yet to tell me.
Chase is no more than a cable's length away now, John boy, said Michael calmly.
3 white lanterns at the foremast in a vertical line.
Thank you.
And did I forget to mention that you lied from the very beginning of our second meeting? For which I hope you will forgive me. That, as I have said, I did not imagine this. Would it help if I offered you a larger share of the venture?
No.
Seeing the look of surprise on Winston's face, even if he tried to disguise it, Pearce added,
You could have trusted me with everything, Arthur, and that is the one thing which you have not understood, and which has irritated me no end.
Obviously, he responded in a soft, regretful tone, I have misjudged you.
More than you know.
If you will not take an increased share, how can I make it up to you?
You cannot, and it makes no odds. We're in a bad situation, and we have to get out of it. I have to find a way, without any of the weapons I need to effect it, how to encourage this lot pursuing us to desist. If you have any ideas, I would be grateful.
I'm sorry.
Is that for lying, or for a lack of imagination?
The crack of what sounded like a musket was loud enough to carry, even if the range at which it was discharged was too far off to be a risk. It was a message being sent over the water telling Pearce to heave to. He shot down below to where he had left the pistols, now wormed and unloaded, and came back on deck with one, horn in his other hand. Priming one quickly, he cocked it, laid it on the bulwarks so it could not be seen for what it was, and fired it off, only to turn back to face a curious Arthur Winston.
Let's hope they think we have muskets too. The sound is not too dissimilar, even without a ball.
As long as they don't guess what little we've got in the way of powder and shot, Michael replied.
I think they will be a last resort, Michael, but load them anyway.
The Irishman nodded. They were not much good unless you could see the whites of an opponent's eyes, and would only be of any use if they were actually close to being boarded. The cry came from the bows.
By the mark, free!
They found a log, Michael said. Bless them.
Doing a quick calculation in his mind, Pearce grabbed the telescope and, tucking it into his breeches, ran for the mainmast shrouds, his still bare feet gripping the tarred lines.
He was over the cap in record time and well on his way to the crosstrees before Winston asked Michael what he was doing.
"Holy Mary, can you not guess? He'll be looking for our landfall, and he will also look for any sails that might give those bastards pause. Do you think he will succeed?"
Michael just shrugged. But looking aloft, he could see Pearce throwing a leg across an upper yard, then securing himself so he could use the spyglass. The point of that moving left and right before steadying, indicating he had spotted what he was looking for. That was held for a while before he searched the horizon in all directions, naturally including the pursuit, to observe that the man coning her had every available body standing on his bulwark to stiffen the lugger against the wind and improve her rate of sailing. The faces were not yet distinct, but he could see the bodies of the more adventurous, as, almost on the tips of their bare feet, they hung on to a shroud or a line as they leant out over the grey-green waters below, loose shirts billowing, but eyes fixed on the bylander with a degree of concentration that testified to their determination. Pearce knew it was fanciful to think he could feel their hatred, yet he could not put aside the sensation, and since it was an uncomfortable one, he returned the telescope to his breeches and, grabbing a backstay, slid back down to the deck.
"There are no vessels close by that can either aid us or prevent those fellows doing what they please. But I have seen the white cliffs below Ramsgate. We are close to home, and, more to the point, close to requiring a change to a more southerly course. The pity is, that will aid the pursuit." "How so?" "They will shave the corner, Arthur. Still, it matters not. If we are going to put an end to this chase, we have precious little time to think of a way to do it. Michael, hold this course for now while I see what I can find below." "I will join you," Winston said, quick to dog his heels. Just as they reached the hatchway, the pursuit discharged another musket, another demand to heave to. "You're sure it would not be wise to just surrender?" "We do not know who those fellows are, only that we are in possession of what they see as their property. And they will be of a mind that it is us who have stolen it. Think of the likely nature of the men we might be dealing with. Then ask yourself what you would do in their place." "I would certainly not commit foul murder. It is barbarous." "Well, I, for one, will not trust to their morality, on the grounds they might have none." "But if we dispute with them, it will make matters worse." There was just enough light to see Pearce's grin. "Not if we beat them." Michael's voice came down the hatchway. "Well short of a cable now, John boy. They'll not be long in trying musket range." The holds were full to capacity, and Pearce was reminded of what he had noticed last night when coming below to sleep. Literally, there was no room to swing a cat below decks on a merchant vessel. Had there been a full crew, they would have been squashed into a cubbyhole in the forepeak, while the master used the poky cabin in which they had slept the night before. This caused something to occur to him he should have thought of before. "Arthur, look in the lockers of that cabin and see if you can find any flags." "Why? Please stop asking questions and do as I bid you." The look that got, again barely visible, was still obvious. Winston was miffed to be spoken to in such a manner. "Arthur, I have no time for hurt feelings, and neither have you." Struggling to recall the exact cargo, Pearce called out to ask Winston, but there being no reply, he guessed he was inside the cabin and had not heard. It was packed so tight that nothing beyond the aft outer layer was available to him, and the space left to get round the hull was so cramped he had a genuine fear that, if it moved while he was between the scantlings and the bales, he might be crushed. Everything was wrapped in tarpaulins, making it difficult to see other than that which lay right before his eyes. With some effort, he pushed himself upwards, reaching forward a hand until it made contact with straw. Feeling further, he felt cold glass and roundness. It was a flask, and should mean quality brandy. It took even more effort to get higher, but stretched fingers told him the flagons lay close to the deck timbers, and would be reached easier through the hatch covers. An image of that low-decked lugger coming out in pursuit came to his mind, at the same time as an idea. What he envisaged would not stop the pursuit, but it might slow it down, and that was better than nothing. So he struggled to get down till his bare toes touched the deck, then to squeeze himself out till he could breathe properly.
There he found Winston holding a pair of flags, one the stripes of the Dutch Republic, another the triple-turreted white castle on a red background of Hamburg.
"I've found the brandy. I am all for an uplifting libation, John, but,
Winston was talking to himself. Pearce was running up to the deck, calling out to bring up the flags. By the time Winston reached fresh air, he saw 3 of the Pelicans tearing at the covers of the hatches, pulling back the canvas to reveal the cargo. First, some thin packets right up against the deck beams, then, under those, row upon row of tightly packed brandy flasks in wooden boxes, each wide part of the glass wrapped in protective straw.
"Out with them." "What for?"
asked Rufus.
"Can't you tell, lad?"
Charlie joked, cutting off any explanation.
"We's going to get them drunk." "Get them out," Pearce ordered, "and lie them along the larboard bulwark. Might I ask you to take care, given they are quite valuable?" Winston said. "French brandy fetches a very high price now."
Pearce grinned. "It always did, I seem to recall."
"Now amiss with apple brandy?" Charlie insisted.
"People of refinement don't agree, Charlie." Mock surprise was the response.
"You saying I ain't a knob, John Pearce?"
"No time for banter, friend." Pearce jerked his head to indicate the lugger was close indeed. "Rufus, get aloft with a line to the mainmast cap and drop it over. Quick now, before they are in range to take a potshot at you." Rufus had all the agility of his years, and enough real fear to respond like a startled hare to what he was being told. He grabbed a spare line off a cleat and went up the shrouds like a squirrel, hand over hand, the rope over his shoulder. Once on the cap, he was told to throw his rope over, and the first flagon was lashed on.
"Haul away, Rufus!"
Pearce called, and up it went on command, an act that was repeated 6 times. The next report of the musket had Pearce looking at the lugger's forepeak, where a fellow, balanced on the bowsprit, was passing back the discharged musket, while one of his mates was handing him another loaded weapon. That had to be ignored. It would be a damned lucky shot to hit anyone at that range, muskets being inaccurate at anything over 50 paces, while the fellow was standing on a moving platform, rising and falling on the swell. Pearce called up to Rufus to give him instructions, the first of which was to crouch down behind the mast and wait. "Arthur, get below and fetch up the cutlasses." The man stood rooted to the spot, as if Pearce had not spoken, until the second musket was fired. This time the ball crossed over their heads, the crack of that making him move. Pearce ran for the binnacle, talking to the man steering. "Michael, you're too much of a target, and besides, I need you with a sword in your hand. Let us change our course now and then lash off the wheel." "We'll need to trim the sails as well. That spanker most of all." Pearce grinned. "The Navy has made a sailor of you." He called to Charlie to lay the pistols behind the binnacle, then had him help trim the braces on the main canvas. Even if he knew it would cost them speed, he had Michael alter course and lash off the wheel before they could attack the set of the spanker, a sail they would not have been able to handle without the Irishman, with a struggling Charlie Taverner using what breath he could muster, calling aloft to Rufus that he was an idle bugger, and getting as much abuse in reply. For all he was hauling on a rope, he was not sure he was totally in control of. Not aided by the pitch and roll of the ship, Pearce experienced a strange feeling of pride then. They were in danger, and it might be mortal, but they could still jest with each other, while nothing made him more satisfied than the way they obeyed every instruction he issued without complaint. In short, his pelicans trusted him, and for a man who had had few long-term friends in his life, it brought a lump to his throat. That emotion evaporated as another musket ball cracked by. The pursuit had closed to the point where the man on the lugger's wheel was edging his bowsprit close to the bylander's taffrail, and, as expected, to windward. Those men stiffening the keel had abandoned the bulwarks and were now preparing themselves for boarding, and it was obvious they had no shortage of weapons. "Where's Winston with those cutlasses?" He was not on deck, so Pearce rushed below as another musket was discharged. Once down the hatchway, he found Winston crouched down and visibly trembling, the cutlasses gathered in his arms. "God help me, John. I fear I am about to soil myself, and my stomach is in turmoil." The sound was so pitiful it halted Pearce's angry bark. Clearly the fellow was terrified, and if he knew anything, he knew there was no time to do anything about it.
"Give me the weapons."
The hands that passed them over were shaking.
"For the love of creation, stay here."
"I must help."
"The only help you can give is to pray to whatever gods you believe in."
"I'm sorry, John." There was really no point in doing other than patting his shoulder and leaving. Back on deck, he threw the swords into the bulwarks, calling on the others to get there and crouch down.
"We can't do a tot of rum, lads, but you might want to crack the neck off one of those bottles and have yourself a nip." "I'll drink when it's over,"
Michael replied, which surprised Pearce. Michael was an imbiber of note.
"Bugger that,"
Charlie whooped, as he lifted a flask and cracked it on the top of a cleat, severing a jagged edge. Then he lifted it, and keeping the glass clear of his mouth, had an untidy swallow. That before he growled. The brandy hitting the back of his throat caused that, and was followed by a furious headshake.
"By Christ, that's a fine brew!"
They could hear loud shouting now, and in amongst that, clear indications of what they intended to do. There was no more musket fire now. They probably reckoned they did not need it, though Pearce harboured a hope, very faint he knew, that they had run out of powder or shot. The noise rose, the voices became clearer. Their guts were going to be garters, their gizzards were going to be sliced open, and, most fearful of all, were the threats to feed them to the fish. Pearce, as the lugger took their wind, stood up and looked straight down into a vessel now close to coming alongside, into a sea of faces, more than 24 in number, all screaming imprecations. A musket being levelled to take him, it was agony to hold still for several seconds before it was discharged, he ducking back down only just in time.
"Rufus, as soon as you think you can."
"Not yet, John." Was it the wrong man in the wrong place, Pearce thought, before putting such a useless thought aside. What he did know was that he was required to cause another distraction, to stand again and let another musket fire at him. At all costs he had to keep their eyes on the deck. This time he stood and stepped out into plain view, only to see that the gap was close to gone, and he was facing not one musket but 3, all of them discharged as soon as he became visible. He dived sideways and shouted as the balls cracked past him.
"Damn it, Rufus, now!"
Back to safety, he craned his neck to see if his instructions had been obeyed. The youngster had the first flagon, now stripped of straw, by the neck, and he threw the dark green bottle, with Pearce watching it tumble through the air, its progress seeming to be dreamlike, it was so slow. But there was no mistaking the sound of breaking glass, nor that the second was on the way.
"You too, Michael!"
he called. The Irishman, sitting with his back to the bulwark, lobbed another bottle into the forepeak, and that too broke. Charlie, at the same time, standing just enough to throw another flagon at the head of the man on the wheel, every one breaking on contact. Pearce grabbed the pistols and scurried across the planking, then got upright enough to discharge first one pistol, then the second, which got heads ducking and stopped in its tracks the idea of reloading those muskets. Better still, it made those planning to board move, and as they did so, he heard the loud, pained curses as they trod on the broken glass. His hope that such wounded feet would cut the numbers who could board, and might even make them sheer off to clear their deck, granting him time to reopen the gap. What followed, Pearce could not have foreseen. His idea had been merely to cause delay, coming to him from seeing those barefooted men stiffening the keel by standing on the bulwarks, reasoning that they would still be likewise when they came alongside. The notion of inflammable vapour had not occurred, while the flash he saw could only have come from a dropped musket, one that was already primed. There was a sudden burst of bluish flame, and it rose high enough to shoot up that great red sail. More than that, short in duration as it was, it scared the men who lined up on the deck and had them running in all directions over all that broken glass. There was one fellow with sense and a healthy fear of flames. He grabbed an axe and cut away the falls holding the sail, trying to get it clear before it set fire to anything else. The sail began to flap as the way came off the lugger, its head falling to starboard as the current pressed it over, and the gap between the vessels opened up. An elated John Pearce stood to jeer, and he moved towards the larboard bulwark without looking down.
Unshod, he cut his own foot on the jagged top of the bottle from which Charlie Taverner had imbibed, and the sharp pain made him drop to his knees. Looking back, he was able to see the blood oozing through his toes, as well as the gash on his sole. Chapter 21. It was impossible to know why the pursuit was not resumed, though Rufus, left aloft, was allotted the task of watching out for it. Perhaps it was cut feet, maybe the mainsail was too damaged. It mattered not, certainly to John Pearce, who had spent an age while Michael sought to stem the flow of blood from his foot. Seeing it needed to be stitched, Rufus was fetched down to apply his superior skill, and once that task was over, not without pain, a makeshift bandage was applied, though it was one which left Pearce hobbling, damned uncomfortable on a moving deck. "Sure, you'll need a stick, John boy," Michael opined. That was soon provided by cutting one of the hooked poles they had used to exit the Gravelin Canal, with a bit of rope work, some padding, and another section providing a rest for Pearce's arm. Even with that, he had to walk on his heel, for to put any pressure on his toes might reopen the gash. He was on the wheel, the charts he needed on the deck before him, weighted down to keep them from flying away on the wind. Now they were within sight of the Downs anchorage, perhaps another reason the chase had not resumed, making exceedingly slow progress into an up-channel current on the seaward side of the Goodwin Sands, the anchorage as full of shipping as it had been when they departed, the flag at their masthead that of neutral Hamburg, the hope being that such a standard would keep the curious at bay. Certainly the Navy, if they were even at sea, would be cautious. But the worry was a revenue cutter, and Rufus, sewing done, was back on the mainmast cap as a lookout.
"Will that sun never go?"
Winston, who seemed to have found some passable sea legs, mouthed this complaint while looking east towards the seemingly endless flat marshlands that lay between Deal and Sandwich, while simultaneously aching to close with the high bluffs to the south of Walmer Castle. Pearce wasn't listening. He was too busy trying to make sense of the charts, seeking out landmarks, while the light held, to give him some clue as to his precise position in relation to the 10-mile-long sandbank, aware that if he got it wrong they would, like so many ships before them, end up stuck, praying for a tide to wash them clear before a storm and heavy seas came along to send them to perdition. Charlie was employing a weighted line to test the depth, one he had spent hours knotting at fathom intervals, for a search of the ship had found no such item.
"It would be a blessing if it clouded over."
Pearce made that remark, knowing it required no further explanation. There was barely a cloud anywhere. So even with a much less than full moon, a clear sky full of stars meant a luminous sea, so anyone on those cliff tops would be able to see what he was up to when he changed course.
"You fret too much, John."
"Do I, Arthur? It strikes me you might be too sanguine."
"In this I trust to what I have been told. The revenue men are not numerous, while the coastline they have to protect is endless. And what does it matter if there is one fellow? The chances of a strong party being in one place is slight, and in the right place even slimmer, I fancy."
Pearce was tempted to remark that, for a man who had so recently turned to jelly, Winston had quite surprisingly recovered his self-confidence. Perhaps it was the advantage of the fearful to be able to shed their terror as quickly as it occurred.
"Let's get those lanterns rigged before the light goes. I'm going to change into my naval coat." "To gain respect?" Winston asked, almost amused.
"No, Arthur. To keep myself warm." In some 9 hours of darkness there appeared to be no trouble about timing the tide so that Pearce could safely beach, the notion being that he'd do so well before it was at its lowest and haul off slowly, which would allow for the unloading, while once that was completed, it still falling would allow him to float out on a much lightened vessel. The task then to get Winston's ship back to the Thames and to anchor. He and the Pelicans could then boat back upriver to the Liberties. Up in the bows, Charlie was casting his weighted line, calling out the depth under the keel, as well as reassuring Pearce that under him he had sand, not rock,
for the approach into St. Margaret's Bay was not generous in that regard. What had been white cliffs faded first to grey, then to black, and it was only then that Pearce got Rufus aloft with a working lantern and some of that straw from the brandy bottles used as tapers to light the signal lamps. As soon as the last one was fired, 2 red lamps appeared on shore, the reply signal, to tell the men sailing the Hemoine that not only were the men who had unloaded present, but that no one who could interfere was around. Pearce, as he saw them, was only aware he had been holding his breath by the quantity of air that escaped from his lungs.
"By the mark 1, Charlie called, "and shelve him fast." "Anchor, Michael."
The splash of the stern anchor sounded as though it could be heard in France. Was it imagination that had Pearce thinking it echoed around the bay? The time it had taken to rig that anchor cable to the capstan had underlined the lack of his ability to help. Much discussed, the notion was to use the tide, the stern anchor and the unloading in combination to keep just enough water under the keel to stay afloat. Pearce never mentioned that it would also allow for a rapid departure if necessary. The ship was hardly moving, with Pearce listening for the first scrunch as the shallow keel on the bow touched the layer of sand that lay just beyond the shingle of the beach. That was now a strand awash with lights. By faint outline, he could see that a number of men were carrying a ramp, and he edged the wheel to bring the bylander in so that the bowsprit was pointing slightly off, that allowing the ramp, which he suspected had grappling hooks, to be attached.
"Michael!"
he called, as he felt the slight shudder under his one good foot. That had the Irishman and Charlie Taverner leaning on the capstan to halt the inward drift, while Rufus let fly the scrap of topsail, which they had used to get inshore, the northeast wind having held steady.
"We have made it, John."
"We have, Arthur." There was a loud clunk as the ramp dropped onto the forward bulwark, and within seconds the first head appeared, lantern held high enough aloft to show a very fat face, a visage added to a body shape made more obvious when he came closer, which had John Pearce say in surprise, "Barnes?"
"The very same,"
replied Winston, as a party of men swarmed up behind.
"Why is he carrying a pistol?" Pearce demanded. "And why is it aimed at me?"
The laugh from Arthur Winston made him examine the man's face, lit from below by the binnacle, which made him look like the very devil. More worrying was that he too had a pistol in his hand, one of the pair belonging to Michael, and it was no more than 2 feet away, pointed right at his gut, so he was only vaguely aware of those rushing past him.
"Let me say, Pearce, you have done quite brilliantly, though I confess to being worried at one time that I would forfeit my life on this venture."
"You're a peach," Barnes said, with Pearce aware that he was not the referred-to fruit.
"Thank you," Winston replied, "but I cannot tell you how simple it was. John boy!"
The cry came from Michael, and there was just enough light as he flicked his gaze past Winston to see both he and Charlie with hands held out from their bodies, while others had taken over control of the anchor cable. He was looking into Winston's eyes again by the time he replied, and that was to tell his friends to do nothing, his next call being to get Rufus back down on deck.
"Do I warrant an explanation?"
There was a sneer in the response.
"Are you not so clever that you can work it out for yourself?"
"I suspect the Pelican was not happenstance, as you called it."
"It was, but in the end a most fortuitous one. I was pursuing a number of schemes, as one must, for not all will come to fruition. You, unwittingly, provided the pattern by which I could see this one in the round."
"The Pelican is not much frequented by sea officers."
"True, but it is a prime place to seek out the needy. A man badly in debt, offered a decent sum, is a fellow easily tempted. My first impression was that you were such a fellow, and so open about your dilemmas, as well as the problems of your friends, that I wondered at my good fortune to the point of near pinching myself. Then you mentioned your prizes, which I have to admit came as a disappointment, since you seemed perfect." Did you know my name and background before we spoke?
No, but you would not credit what information you can extract from an Admiralty doorman for the price of a tankard of ale, especially when the fellow in question is one he purports to despise as a low creature undeserving of his rank. My inquiries regarding you were general but interesting, and helped to fill out a conversation that led to what I was really after. You are, after all, not the only King's officer without employment." The hatch covers were off again, and the first of the cargo was being rushed down the ramp to disappear into the dark, and Pearce paused to watch that, really to give himself time to think through what he was being told.
"The day I came to see you, you were expecting a visitor."
"You have a quick mind. Certainly speedy enough to make that association, which I believe I acknowledged previously."
"Another naval officer in need of money?"
Winston nodded. "But not one who, it turned out, had your quite exceptional advantages, or, I have to say, your needs, not to mention your writ-bound friends from the Liberties, who even had protections, forsooth. It is a pity this is not an enterprise I can repeat, for the fellow was very much in need of funds."
Pearce was back at that breakfast, reprising the conversation. This man had sucked him in, providing such a complete answer to his needs, and that had blinded him. It had been clever, the way he'd been drawn in by the drip of information. There had been no ship name because the target vessel was unknown, and there was a very good chance the men unloading the Hemoine were the very same folk who had rowed that galley across the channel. If there was nothing he could say, he felt he had to do something, had to find some line by which he could puncture this bastard's certainties. Pearce leant to take up his makeshift stick, an act that got him a slight dig in the stomach with Winston's pistol, so his notion of clouting him needed to be immediately abandoned. But the act had turned him, so he was now partly facing the beach, and the first thing he noticed was that the line of lanterns, those carrying the contraband goods, were not ascending the steep hill that enclosed the bay. He had stood off in daylight in that Deal wherry, and had a picture in his mind of the shape of the bay and the arc of near vertical hills from the beach to the heights, cut by a winding track, with no way out to north or south when the tide was in, because of the sea. Yet the line of lanterns was heading for the cliffs, and, just at that moment, one he had half an eye on was extinguished. The next in line the same, in a way that seemed altogether too sudden.
"So, this ship is stolen after all,"
he said, prevaricating, so he could make certain what he had seen was not some illusion.
"Profits without much in the way of expenditure, which is a very sweet trade."
"Except those who you took it from will not just let such a theft pass."
Winston laughed out loud.
"You were right to think them smugglers. Can you see them going to the forces of the law to say that their contraband has been stolen? I think not. And should they search for the miscreant, it will not be me, will it? Given my identity and my face is unknown to them, which is not the case with yours. You even had me hide mine, so convinced were you of my tale."
"So you were not in terror, or really ill, but in hiding when you stayed below?"
"Correct, and banking on your seeing off the pursuit."
"And if we had not?"
"I dare say that would have taxed me somewhat, but I did have the threat of retribution, or perhaps the means to convince them I could buy them off with the purchase of their cargo, while I have to add there is no hope of yield without risk. A point you put so eloquently to me, I recall. Was it not you who persuaded me to proceed with this venture?"
"Is your name, I wonder, really Arthur Winston?"
"Enough!"
Barnes insisted. That was barked in a way that indicated to Pearce it was not his real name, and he suspected the fat fellow's name to be false as well. Yet he was curious as to their association. Was it of long standing, or had one sought out the other merely as a way of doing business? Speculate he might, but more vital was what was about to happen now.
"Do you intend to kill us?"
"No, no. That, as I said, is a barbarous notion. Once the cargo is unloaded and we are gone, I have it on good authority a certain party of gentlemen will come down from the heights and effect an arrest."
There will be no contraband. We shall make a small sacrifice, the fat man sneered. Enough, his companion added, to satisfy those who oversee the excise. And what are you doing in the name of creation, beaching a ship so secretly in such a secluded bay with not another soul in sight? Have you bribed them? He's not short on questions, is he? Spat the fat one, given Pearce had addressed that to him. He was long on greed, and that is all that matters. Pearce turned his head to see the goods being fetched out of the hold, a task being carried out at speed. Then he looked back again to see lanterns appear, and suddenly it all made sense. The cliffs were chalk, perfect for tunnelling, which meant these villains had to be local, so there would be a route inside that would take them up to the heights and habitation unseen. That he had bribed the local excisemen was likely, not that it made any odds, except that there would be little point in pleading he and his friends had been duped. "Last bell's coming out," called a voice, just as the ship began to heel over, which told Pearce that she was now well and truly beached, and any notion of sailing her away before the tide came in again was gone. They had thought of everything. "Time to go, I think," said the man who had made a fool of him, the sudden thought coming to him, entirely inappropriate, that Charlie Taverner was an amateur by comparison. "Right, everybody off," called the fat man. The tip of Winston's pistol, Pearce could not think of what else to call him, was lifted to his hat in mock salute. "Let me say this, John Pearce. You were very nearly a worthy adversary. There were times when you had me jumping, and to think, when I offered you more of a share, you turned me down. Such a sense of nobility, mon ami." That had him laughing again, a sound that faded as he departed the ship and walked up the beach, leaving the fat fellow to deliver the last message. "Stay on board the ship and make no attempt to follow, for if I say I am more of a barbarian, you will understand." Then he too was gone, waddling down a ramp that disappeared from the top of the bulwark as soon as he was off it. He watched as the lanterns disappeared, all except the last one, which was held in one of the fat fellow's hands. In the other he had his pistol, which he raised and discharged, sending out a flash as well as a sound that did echo round the narrow bay. Then the lights went out. By the time the fat man had carried out his last task, a gunshot to alert the excise, the others had joined him by the binnacle. Pearce was no longer looking at the cliffs, he was looking at the rim of the heights, and, sure enough, before that echo died away, pinpoints of light appeared. "That was a sign," Pearce said, having given his friends the briefest of explanations. "We're trapped," said Rufus, "so we'll have to fight them." "We still has the cutlasses," Charlie added. "Belay," Pearce barked. "That is to risk a hanging if any of them are killed." He pulled what money he had left from his pocket, and, emptying out the purse, handed half of it to O'Hagan. "Michael, lower yourself over the side and help the others down. There's a path right in the middle of the bay, and it's the only way in and out. But with a low tide, you can go north. You might get wet feet, but I know it is possible to walk to Deal from here, and the tide is still falling." "How do you know?" "There's no time to explain," he replied. In truth, he did not want to say he had taken his boating trip without telling them anything about it. Vital was the fact that Winston had no knowledge of it. In the gloom, he thought he saw Charlie Taverner unwilling to accept that statement, but Michael cut him off, for he at least must appreciate the need for speed. "What about you, John boy?" "With this foot, I can't go anywhere, and if I tried, I would slow you down. So I will stay by the binnacle so they can see me. In coming for me, it will give you a chance to get clear. If you can get away, best you try to get in touch with Mr. Lutchens. I'm sure he will help you. There is money owing to you and I from a fellow called Davidson, which he knows about." "Pearce," said Charlie, not in complaint but worry, "how in hell's name can we just leave ya?" "Charlie, there's no time to waste. Every one of you is in double jeopardy. Get off from this damn boat and find at the very least somewhere to hide till the tide is right out. Now go!" "A hand, John Pearce?" asked Rufus, holding out his own. He took each hand in turn, and, with a lump in his throat, said, "Take care, all of you."
It was agony watching those lights weaving down the steep slope, trending left and right as they followed the steep, winding path. His foot was throbbing, but the real pain was seated in his damaged pride. Once they got low enough, he walked away from the binnacle light to look onto the beach, and there, as he had been told there would be, was a line of contraband, several barrels and bales, hardly a problem for a gang that must have cleared thousands in money from those packed holds. Finally, the lanterns were on the beach, with no indication of a hue and cry, so perhaps the others had got clear. The crunch as the excise men came down the beach was like the knell of doom, for Pearce knew he could look forward to a life of misery from now on. Then he put his hand in the pocket of his blue broadcloth coat again, to touch that tin of earth from Paris which had travelled with him. What would old Adam Pearce say about his son now? And would he ever get those bones out of their Parisian resting place? "You there! Don't move!" called a voice, and John Pearce burst out laughing, wondering as he did so if they would go below and fetch for him his ditty bag, and, most of all, his shoes. Epilogue. A week in the Sandwich jail was not unpleasant, given he had enough money left to pay the warder for food and comfort, as well as a medical man to tend to his now healing foot, though it would not yet take a shoe. More troubling were his own thoughts, for, hardly surprisingly, he could not get out of his mind what had just happened, and every reprise of recent events made him feel more of an idiot than the last. With hindsight, he could see so many flaws in the way he had been deceived that it beggared belief he had fallen for them in the first place. Still, he would soon have more to worry about. A letter to Davidson, pen and paper provided by the warder for a fee, had established his affairs were still up in the air. Nothing was resolved. So the fine he was expecting of £100, standard for smuggling, as he had been informed, he could not pay. So it was either hard labour or transportation he was facing, and he was up before the Justice of the Peace in an hour. He had written to Emily Barclay too, but that letter, to his mind unfinished, was yet to be sent. Time to put the last touches to a missive that would tell her that, while he loved her deeply, the notion of their being together was one she would have to put aside, if indeed she had ever truly harboured it. "I have instructed Davidson to provide for you as best he can, and said that any prize money should go to you, unless it can be used to secure my release. Not that I think that a likely event once sentence has been passed. Please be assured once more of my deep love for you, and my wish that if you can find happiness, you should do so. It would probably be best to forget you ever knew a man called John Pearce." With that, he signed it. "Lieutenant John Pearce?" asked the clerk of the court. All he could do to that was nod and reply yes. He had used his naval rank in the hope it might ameliorate what was coming. The court was crowded with the usual set of ghouls, many hoping for a hanging, no doubt. But there was a commotion at the back as 3 men elbowed their way to the front, and that made Pearce curse. What the hell were his pelicans doing here? The charges were read out, and he entered a plea of guilty, all the while glaring at the body of the court where his friends now sat, a look that was returned with bland indifference. "The fine for evading the excise duty is set by statute at £100. Do you have that sum to pay to the court?" "No." The justice was about to speak when Charlie Taverner stood up and cried out, "May it please, Your Honour!" That got him a jaundiced look over the magistrate's half-glasses. "Is it not the case that if a fellow convicted of smuggling can provide 2 men for His Majesty's Navy who have the skills of the sea, the fine is waived?" "That is so." "Then can I say that my mate here and I," Rufus stood up, looking far from confident, "were approached by this here Lieutenant Pearce to join up for the bounty, which we will happily put aside in his favour." Charlie held up his piece of parchment. "Even having this?" A sharp instruction was given, and the clerk of the court took from the pair their protections, which were handed up to and closely examined by the Justice of the Peace, before he looked back out at the well of the court.
"You are volunteering for the Navy?" "That's right, Your Honour."
That set the court a-buzzing. If it was not expected for men to condemn themselves out of their own mouths as smugglers, that was what this pair were doing, for only a fool would believe their connection to the man in the dock was other than that. The Navy was not much given to taking criminals. In truth, they were dead against it. But smugglers were an exception, given they were bound to be at home on a ship and thus highly valued.
"You are competent seamen?" "We are," Charlie replied. "Both of you?" "Yeah."
The magistrate paused for a moment to consider his response, but when he did speak, it was with firm purpose.
"Sergeant of the court, take these men into custody to be handed over to the receiving officer of the impress service at Dover. You, Lieutenant Pearce, have satisfied the needs of justice, and you are thus free to go." "I protest."
The words he was about to utter, that he would not accept the verdict, died in his throat. Michael O'Hagan was shaking his head, and in truth, any intervention he could make was too late. Charlie and Rufus were already on their way. Minutes later, a free man, he hobbled out of the courthouse to join the Irishman.
"That was madness."
"Was it, John Boy?"
"We talked long this last week while we hid out in Dale to see what became of you. Where I must go to look for those who near did for us all. You'd be wasting your time. They would be unlikely to show, and if they did, what can we two do against so many? Charlie and Rufus had no mind to go back to the Liberties, as I have not myself, but I will wait to find what risk I am under, since you say my name is not known. It was plain we all owed our freedom to you."
"They did not have to go back," Pearce protested. He knew, even as he said the words, they were false. Charlie and Rufus, with writs against their name, could not just wander the land in safety. If it was not the Liberties, it was more likely to be the same kind of risk Pearce felt he had faced before going into the court.
"Take it for what it is, John Boy. Two men who consider you a friend, doing what they thought best, and that included for themselves. They have no love of sea service, but even that is better than what they had afore. At sea they are safe from the law. And what of us, Michael?"
The Irishman just smiled. If he was aware of the turmoil in the mind of John Pearce, he said nothing. Just abandoning Charlie and Rufus he could not do and live with himself, while he was at a stand to know what to do with his life, Emily Barclay notwithstanding. It was the same dilemma he had laboured under ever since coming back from Paris, the lack of a clear path to a decent future, for he was not fitted for much. Those prizes might pay out, and then again they might not, and even then the sums were not great enough to provide security, which, if it engendered a painful reminder of how foolish he had been in going to Gravelin, also harked him back to the reason. The solution was obvious, if not entirely pleasant. He needed security for both himself and the woman he loved. He needed to help his friends, and there was only one place that could be achieved.
"You must see I have to find a way to repay them, or at the very least ease their lives."
Michael nodded and gave a look that told Pearce he understood what that meant.
"How do you feel about being servant to a naval lieutenant?"
"Sure. I would be a cack-handed one."
"Not as cack-handed or headed, for that matter, as the man you will be obliged to see to. So, John Boy, where to now?" "First, back to the town jail to retrieve a letter I wrote. Then we must go to Dover and see what we can do for Charlie and Rufus." "And then?" "Then, Michael, I am going to beard the First Lord of the Treasury, whom you might know as William Pitt, as well as a companion of his called Henry Dundas. They made me certain promises, and I intend they should keep them."
You have been listening to Blown Off Course. It was written by David Donachie and read by Jonathan Keeble. Other recordings by David Donachie include
The Scent of Betrayal, A Game of Bones, and An Ill Wind. This has been a Soundings Audiobooks presentation. If you have enjoyed this production, please write to us at Isis House, Kings Drive, Whitley Bay, Tyne and Wear, NE26 2JT, or call 0191 253 4155, or visit our website at www.isis-publishing.co.uk, and you will be sent a full list of our recordings.